trail to the old fire lookout tower wasn't on any of the park maps. I had found it through an online forum where people shared forgotten hikes and abandoned places. According to the post, the tower hadn't been used in decades, left to rot after the new fire watch stations were built. Something about the remoteness of it drew me in, so I packed my gear and set out early in the morning. The first few miles were easy, the path clear though overgrown in places. As I climbed higher, the trees grew closer together, and the air grew heavy with quiet. Birds called now and then, but for the most part, it was silent. I kept going, following the directions I had copied from the post, watching for the stacked stones that marked each turn. By late afternoon, I saw it through the trees. The tower rose above the canopy, its wooden structure weathered and gray, but still standing. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, but they held. When I reached the top, I found a hatch unlocked. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood, and the light through the grime-covered windows gave everything a faded look. The room was small but intact. There was an old metal chair, a cot with a moth-eaten blanket, and a table in the center. On the table were maps, dozens of them spread out in a careful, deliberate pattern. I moved closer and realized they were marked with strange symbols, circles and lines intersecting in ways I didn't understand. Some of the marks were new, drawn in sharp black ink, while others were faded as if done years ago. Next to the maps were piles of photographs. At first they seemed random. Hikers smiling in front of trailheads, groups sitting around campfires, people crossing rivers. But then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. In one photo I saw myself. I was standing on a ridge, looking out over a valley. It was a shot from a solo trip I'd taken last spring, a trip I hadn't told anyone about. I picked it up and stared at it. It was me, no question. Same jacket, same backpack, even the same faint scar above my eyebrow. The angle of the shot was odd, though it was taken from a distance, through trees I hadn't noticed at the time. My hands trembled as I set it back down and flipped through more of the photos. There were others I recognized, faces I'd seen on the trail before. Some of them looked familiar because they were in posts I had read online about missing hikers. I remembered their names and stories. People who had vanished, some without a trace, their last known locations in areas not far from where I stood now. The air in the tower felt heavier, as if the walls were pressing in. I turned to leave but stopped when I noticed a notebook tucked beneath the maps. Its cover was worn leather, and when I opened it, I found lists of names, dates, and coordinates. Some names had been crossed out, some had question marks next to them. My name was there, too, with today's date written in neat handwriting. I slammed the book shut and backed away from the table, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't understand who had written it or how they knew I'd be here. The thought that someone might be watching me even now sent a cold shock through me. I hurried to the hatch and climbed back down the stairs, forcing myself not to look back. The forest seemed different on the way down, quieter than before. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt like I was being followed, though each time I stopped to listen, I heard nothing but my own ragged breathing. The trail markers were harder to spot, and I found myself losing the path more than once. As the sky darkened, I finally reached my car. I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. I didn't look at the tree line as I drove away, afraid of what I might see standing there. It wasn't until I was miles from the trailhead that I let out the breath I'd been holding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photo of me on the ridge, about how close whoever took it must have been. I thought about the names in the notebook, how so many were crossed out. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I had been on someone's list. Maybe I still was. The next day, I tried to find the forum post about the tower, but it was gone. The user who had posted it had deleted their account. I checked missing persons databases, cross-referencing the names I could remember from the notebook. Some were listed, others weren't. It was like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't put together. I still have the map I brought back from that tower, the one marked with the strange symbols. Sometimes I catch myself tracing the lines absent-mindedly, wondering where they lead. I haven't been hiking alone since that day. I'm not sure I ever will again. Story 2. The orphanage stood on the edge of town, shrouded in overgrown trees and a thick sense of abandonment. I had heard stories about it for years, but had never worked up the nerve to visit until that afternoon. The iron gate out front hung open, creaking softly in the breeze as if it had been waiting for someone to step through. I hesitated before pushing it wider and walking up the cracked path toward the entrance. The front doors were heavy, but swung open with a low groan. Inside, the air was cold and stale, carrying the faintest trace of mildew and something harder to place. Something metallic. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight as I crossed the threshold and stepped into the main hallway. My footsteps echoed, making me feel like I wasn't alone even though I knew I was. Peeling wallpaper hung in long strips from the walls, exposing cracked plaster beneath. Names and dates were scratched into the surface, some so deep they had gouged the wood underneath. I passed several doorways leading into empty rooms, each filled with broken furniture and shattered glass. The building was silent, save for the soft creak of the floorboards under my weight. I moved deeper into the orphanage, following a narrow staircase to the second floor. The dormitory wings stretched out in front of me, rows of doors on either side of the hallway. Faded numbers were still nailed to some of them, though a few had fallen and lay scattered on the floor. I chose one of the doors at random and stepped inside. The dormitory was long, with narrow windows lining one wall. Dozens of metal beds were arranged in perfect rows, their thin mattresses still intact but filthy with age. Each bed had leather restraints attached to the frame, cracked and stiff but unmistakable. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand why an orphanage would need something like this. I walked between the beds, running my fingers lightly over the cold metal frames. Some of the restraints had been fastened shut, as if they had been used recently, though that wasn't possible. A faint chill crawled over my skin as I noticed deep scratches in the floor near several beds, as though something or someone had tried to drag itself away but hadn't gotten far. The walls caught my attention next. They were covered in tally marks, carved deep into the paint and plaster beneath. The marks stretched from floor to ceiling in dense clusters, some of them stained darker than the others. I found myself wondering who had made them and how long they had been there, but I knew I didn't really want to know. I snapped a few photos, the flash briefly lighting up the room in stark detail. In that momentary burst of light, I thought I saw something shift at the far end of the dormitory. When I lowered the camera, everything was still again, though the air felt heavier. I took a slow step back, my pulse quickening in my throat. The silence seemed deeper now, thick and watchful. I turned to leave, but a soft sound stopped me. It was a faint tapping, like fingernails against metal. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the beds, but nothing moved. The sound came again, closer this time, from somewhere behind me. I backed toward the door, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. As I reached the threshold, something cold brushed against my arm. But when I looked, there was nothing there. My breath caught in my chest as I slipped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind me. The latch clicked quietly, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I hurried down the hallway, passing more dormitory doors, all slightly ajar. Each one I passed seemed to whisper as I moved by, the faint scrape of wood against wood, though I didn't stop to look inside. At the end of the hall was another staircase, this one narrower and steeper than the first. It led to the attic, though part of me screamed not to go up there. Curiosity pushed me forward. The attic door groaned as I opened it, revealing a dusty space crowded with broken furniture and old trunks. A single window let in a narrow shaft of light, illuminating a chair in the center of the room. The leather straps on its arms and legs were identical to those on the beds downstairs, though these looked newer, less brittle. I didn't take a step closer. Something about the chair made my stomach twist. Then I noticed more tally marks scratched into the floorboards around it, as if someone had sat there counting for a very long time. I took one picture and turned back toward the stairs. As I descended, I heard a door slam somewhere below me. The sound echoed up the stairwell, followed by hurried footsteps that didn't belong to me. My breathing turned shallow as I forced myself to move quickly but quietly, hoping whatever it was wouldn't notice. By the time I reached the first floor again, the footsteps had stopped, but the sense of something nearby lingered. I made my way back to the front entrance, gripping the handle tightly before pushing the door open. Outside, the air felt lighter, and I took a deep breath, feeling like I hadn't done so in hours. I didn't look back until I was through the gate and back on the sidewalk, where I stood for a long moment, staring at the building's dark windows. That night, I reviewed the photos I had taken. In one of the shots of the dormitory, standing near one of the beds, was a figure, pale, thin, and wearing something like a hospital gown, its head tilted slightly as if it was listening. Its eyes, dark and sunken, stared directly into the camera lens. I deleted the picture, but the image stayed in my mind. I never went back to that orphanage. Some nights I still hear the soft tapping sound I heard in that dormitory, as if something is trying to remind me it's still there. Watching, counting, waiting. Wait. Story 3. The entrance to the bunker was half buried beneath years of dirt and leaves. I had to clear away debris just to get to the rusted steel door. It groaned as I pulled it open, the hinges stiff from decades of neglect. A stale rush of air hit my face, carrying the scent of mold and damp concrete. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I stepped inside. The corridor was narrow, lined with cracked walls and peeling paint. Old posters warning of nuclear fallout hung crookedly, their colors faded almost to nothing. My footsteps echoed, the sound hollow and strange in the confined space. I had heard rumors about this place for years. Some people said it was sealed off after the Cold War. Others claimed it was used more recently by squatters or survivalists. No one mentioned how empty it felt. The deeper I went, the more the silence pressed against me, like the bunker had been waiting for someone to come back. In the main room, there were remnants of old supplies. Rusted cans lined metal shelves, and a stack of rotted blankets sat in one corner. An old generator lay in pieces near the wall, long since gutted for parts. I took my time moving through the space, shining the light into corners, half expecting something to move. Toward the back, I found a smaller room with a heavy steel door left ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. The hinges screeched in protest, and I felt a cold draft drift past me. Inside, the walls were bare concrete, stained dark in places. A single rusted cot sat against the far wall, its thin mattress eaten away by time and moisture. Next to the cot was an old tape recorder. It looked out of place, like it had been left there recently, though dust covered every inch of it. The buttons were worn but intact, and a tape sat loaded in the machine. Without thinking too much about it, I pressed play. At first there was only static, soft and uneven. Then, through the hiss, I heard whispers. They were faint, as if the speaker was standing far from the microphone. My name came next, spoken softly, repeated over and over again. Hearing it in that space, surrounded by silence, made my skin crawl. I stopped the tape and rewound it, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. I pressed play again. The same whispering, the same repetition of my name, slowly becoming clearer as the tape continued. It sounded deliberate, like whoever recorded it had been waiting for me to listen. I turned off the recorder and took a step back. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I suddenly became aware of how deep I was in the bunker. There was no cell signal this far underground. No one knew I was here. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the walls were closing in. I told myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe another explorer had left the tape behind as a joke. But I couldn't figure out how they would have known my name, let alone recorded it on an ancient piece of equipment like this. I backed out of the room, keeping my light steady on the doorway. I didn't want to turn my back on it. The tape recorder was still sitting there, silent now, but I could feel it pulling at me, like it wanted me to play the tape again. I shook off the feeling and made my way toward the exit. As I moved back through the main room, I thought I heard something behind me. Soft footsteps, matching my own, only half a beat delayed. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing. The silence was complete again, heavy and unbroken. I walked faster, my footsteps louder now. The narrow corridor ahead seemed longer than before, and my flashlight flickered once, then steadied. My mind raced with possibilities. I tried to stay calm, telling myself the air was just playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the entrance, I found the steel door closed. I was sure I had left it open. My hand trembled as I grabbed the handle and pulled. It groaned, just as before, but it moved, and I slipped out into the open air, gasping as if I had been holding my breath for hours. I didn't stop moving until I was back at my car, parked a quarter-mile from the entrance. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, sitting there in the driver's seat with my hands shaking. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting someone to appear. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering again. My name repeated softly, steadily, as if someone were standing right beside my bed. I kept the lights on, staring at the ceiling until dawn broke through the curtains. A few days later, I decided to go back to the bunker, thinking I'd imagined it all. I brought a friend with me, someone who didn't spook easily. But when we reached the entrance, the steel door was sealed tight. The dirt and leaves had been packed around it again, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. We searched for another way in, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. My friend laughed it off, saying I must have been at a different place. But I knew it was the same bunker. I could still see the faint outline of my own footprints where I had dug through the debris. Since then, I've tried to forget about it. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of a tape recorder clicking on, and the whispering starts again, saying my name over and over, a little closer each time. Story 4. The psychiatric hospital had been abandoned for decades, left to crumble at the edge of town where few people ever ventured. I'd heard stories about it when I was a kid, rumors that it was haunted, that people who went inside never came out the same. I never paid much attention to those stories back then, but as I got older and more interested in urban exploration, the place started to call to me. One overcast afternoon, I decided to see it for myself. Getting inside wasn't hard. The fence surrounding the property had long since rusted away in places, and most of the windows were broken out. I stepped carefully through one of them and found myself in a wide hallway littered with debris, broken glass, fallen ceiling tiles, and scraps of decaying paper. The air was thick with dust and the faint, sharp smell of mold. Each step I took echoed down the corridor like I was being followed. I kept my flashlight steady as I walked, its beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were stained with water damage and graffiti, most of it old and faded. Some of it, though, was newer. Fresh scrawls of strange symbols and phrases I didn't understand covered parts of the walls like warnings. The deeper I went, the quieter everything seemed to get, like even the building was holding its breath. Eventually, I found a staircase leading down to the lower levels. The metal steps groaned under my weight, and a cold draft drifted up from below. The light from above faded as I descended, leaving me in near darkness except for the narrow beam from my flashlight. At the bottom, the hallway stretched out in both directions, but something about the door on the left caught my attention. It stood open just a little, enough to see that the room beyond was different from the others I had passed. I pushed it open the rest of the way, and the door scraped loudly across the floor. Inside, the walls were covered in handprints. Hundreds of them. They varied in size, shape, and placement, some overlapping, some smeared, and all of them stained a deep, dark red that had long since dried. In the center of the room was a single chair, bolted to the floor. It was heavy, made of metal, with leather restraints on the arms and legs. The straps were stiff with age, cracked and discolored, but the stains on them were impossible to ignore. A dark brown, almost black, crust clung to the edges where the buckles met the leather. It didn't take much imagination to figure out what it was. I stepped closer, my heart pounding harder with each movement. The air in the room was colder than it should have been, and it smelled wrong. Metallic, like rust, and something sharper beneath it. I ran my fingers lightly over the back of the chair, and my skin prickled as if the metal were charged with something I couldn't see. There were scratch marks on the floor around the base of the chair, deep grooves cut into the concrete. It looked like someone had struggled, had fought to get away even after they'd been strapped down. I crouched to get a closer look and noticed that some of the scratches were streaked with a darker color, the same brown that stained the restraints. The handprints on the wall seemed to pulse in the dim light, as if they were still fresh and wet. I told myself it was a trick of the flashlight, but part of me didn't believe it. They seemed too deliberate, too desperate. Every one of them looked like it had been pressed there by someone in agony, fingers spread wide, palms flat, as if begging for release. I took a step back toward the door, feeling suddenly exposed. The room felt tighter now, like the walls were leaning in. A faint sound made me freeze, something like breathing, slow and ragged, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I held my breath and listened. It came again, low and uneven, the sound of someone struggling to inhale. I swung the flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. Just the chair and the handprints, and the sense that I wasn't alone anymore. I backed toward the door, one slow step at a time, careful not to make any sudden movements. The breathing grew louder as I moved, echoing around me in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint. As I reached the doorway, something cold brushed against my arm. I turned, heart racing, but nothing was there. Just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. I didn't hesitate. I stepped through the doorway and pulled it shut behind me, the sound of the latch catching far louder than it should have been. I started back the way I came, walking fast but trying not to break into a run. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The halls were empty, but the sound of breathing hadn't stopped. It stayed just behind me, steady and slow, no matter how fast I moved. When I reached the staircase, I climbed it 2 steps at a time. The old metal groaned and shook under me, and for one terrifying second, I thought it would collapse. But I made it back to the main floor, and from there, I ran for the nearest window. I didn't stop until I was through it and back outside in the fading daylight. Even standing in the open air, I could still hear the faint sound of breathing in my ears. It stayed with me all the way back to my car, and even as I drove away from the hospital. At home in my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. Some nights when it's quiet, I swear I still hear it. That slow, ragged breath just behind me, waiting. Story 5. I had heard rumors about the abandoned village for years. It sat deep in the hills, far from any main road, the kind of place you had to be looking for to find. They said it was emptied overnight decades ago, but no one could agree on why. Some said disease, others whispered something darker, but I was curious enough to go see for myself. I packed my gear and made the long hike through winding trails, moving deeper into the hills. By late afternoon, I found what was left of the village. Crumbling homes leaned against each other like tired old men, roofs collapsed, windows empty. Weeds and trees had begun to reclaim the space between them, but the place still held a shape that was unsettlingly intact. I set up camp just outside the edge of the village, close enough to keep it in sight, but far enough that I wouldn't feel surrounded. As the evening settled in, I wandered the narrow dirt paths between the old buildings. Most were stripped bare, just empty shells filled with dust and silence. But there was one house, near the center of the village, that drew me in. It looked no different from the others at first glance. Its door hung open, swinging slightly on rusted hinges as the wind pushed through. Inside, it smelled like rotten earth, the floor warped and creaking under my boots. Yet, as I stepped into what must have been the dining room, I froze in place. There was a long wooden table in the center, draped with a stained, moth-eaten cloth. Plates were arranged neatly along its length, each one holding what had once been food. Now the bread was moldy, the meat reduced to dark, hardened scraps, and the fruit collapsed into itself. But what struck me most were the candles. Thick, white candles placed at either end of the table had burned down recently, their wax pooled fresh on the wooden surface. I crouched close to one of them and touched the wax. It was soft and pliable, as if it had only cooled a few hours ago. My stomach tightened at the thought. This place was supposed to be abandoned for decades. There was no sign of anyone else around, no footprints in the thick dust, no marks on the floor but my own. I backed away from the table, careful not to disturb anything else. The room suddenly felt too quiet, like the air was holding its breath. I turned and left the house quickly, stepping back out into the fading daylight. The village seemed even more still now, the shadows stretching long and thin across the broken ground. That night, back at my camp, I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe other hikers had come through and lit the candles out of curiosity, just as I had been drawn to explore. But the unease wouldn't leave me. As darkness fell, the village beyond the tree line seemed to shift, as if something moved just beyond my line of sight. I stoked the fire higher than I normally would, feeling safer with the light. The woods around me were quiet, no insects or night birds calling out. At some point I must have drifted into a restless sleep, because I woke to the fire burned low and the feeling that someone was watching me. I sat up slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the ring of dying firelight. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the trees and the faint outline of the village in the distance. Then I noticed a dim flicker of light coming from the house with the table. It was faint but steady, like a candle flame. I got to my feet and stood there, heart pounding, trying to decide if I should investigate or leave. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and started toward the village again. The closer I got to the house, the more certain I was that the light was real. It moved slightly, like someone carrying a candle from one side of the room to the other. When I reached the doorway, I paused and listened. There was a faint sound, like murmuring voices, too quiet to make out. I stepped inside, flashlight aimed straight ahead, cutting through the dark. The table was there, just as I had left it. But the candles were lit again, their flame steady despite the draft that moved through the house. At the far end of the room stood a figure. It was pale, dressed in clothes that looked old and worn, its face turned down as if looking at something in its hands. My mouth went dry as I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure raised its head slowly, and though its features were hard to make out, I could see that its eyes were dark and empty. It didn't move toward me, but I felt something shift in the air, a coldness that sank straight to my bones. I backed out of the house without turning, afraid that if I did, I would hear it follow. Once outside, I broke into a run, not stopping until I reached my camp. I grabbed my gear without bothering to pack properly and made my way down the trail by flashlight, not looking back. I didn't stop walking until dawn broke, and even then I kept glancing over my shoulder. I've never gone back to that village, and I don't plan to. Sometimes I dream about that table, set for a dinner no one was meant to finish. Candles burning in a house that should have been cold and dark for decades. And when I wake, I swear I can still smell the faint scent of melted wax hanging in the air. Story 6. The funeral home had been closed for over a decade, yet something about it still drew my curiosity. The windows were boarded up, and the front door had a rusted chain looped through the handles. I found a side entrance where the wood had rotted away, leaving just enough space to slip inside. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint chemical scent that clung to my skin as I moved deeper into the building. Inside, the halls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling away in long strips. Dust coated every surface, and broken light fixtures dangled from the ceiling. It was clear no one had walked these floors in years, yet there was a strange order to everything. Chairs were neatly arranged in rows, and floral arrangements, long dead and brittle, sat untouched in their vases. It was as if whoever ran this place had simply walked out one day and never returned. I made my way toward the embalming room, feeling the air grow colder with every step. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the hinges groaned softly. Inside, I expected decay and filth, but instead I found something disturbingly pristine. The stainless steel table in the center gleamed under the weak beam of my flashlight. The tools, scalpels, forceps, and tubes were lined up carefully on a tray, spotless and shining. A clipboard rested on a counter nearby. Curious, I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Names were listed in neat handwriting, each paired with a date. Some of them were years old, matching the time the funeral home had been closed, but several names were dated for the coming week. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the most recent entries, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The names didn't mean anything to me at first, but one of them, scheduled for 3 days from now, was familiar. It was the name of a woman I'd seen in town just last week. Healthy. Alive. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, maybe some old scheduling that hadn't been updated. But that didn't explain why the tools were clean or why the room smelled faintly of disinfectant. I set the clipboard back down, feeling uneasy. Something wasn't right. The building was supposed to be empty, abandoned, but everything in this room suggested it was still in use. I walked around the table, noticing faint scuff marks on the tile floor, as if heavy equipment had been moved recently. There were fresh scratches on the edge of the table where restraints might have been fastened. I glanced toward a cabinet on the far wall. It was closed, but the dust around its edges had been disturbed. I pulled it open and found shelves stocked with jars of embalming fluids, neatly labeled and full. A few of them had expiration dates years into the future. Whoever was using this place still maintained their supplies, even though no one was supposed to be here. A sudden noise made me freeze. Footsteps, faint but steady, echoed from somewhere in the building. I turned off my flashlight and held my breath, straining to hear. The steps grew louder, then stopped just outside the door. I pressed myself against the cold tile wall, heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked slightly, but no one entered. After a few agonizing seconds, the footsteps moved away, fading into silence. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I slipped out of the embalming room and made my way back down the hall, trying to keep my steps light and quiet. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded deafening. I passed the viewing room, where dusty curtains hung over cracked windows. For a moment I thought I saw a shape move behind one of them, but I didn't stop to look. I reached the side entrance and squeezed back through the narrow gap in the wall. Outside, the cool evening air felt sharp in my lungs. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the street. The funeral home stood dark and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from one of the upstairs windows. Later that night, I searched the names I had seen on the clipboard. A few were unfamiliar, but others had obituaries listed online. People who had died recently, with causes of death that seemed vague. Accidents, sudden illnesses. None of them had been scheduled to be buried through that funeral home. The place wasn't supposed to handle services anymore. Yet there they were, listed on that clipboard with precise dates. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even say? That I trespassed in an abandoned building and found a list of names. Clean tools and fresh chemicals weren't enough to prove anything. Still, I couldn't let it go. I drove past the funeral home a few days later, just before one of the scheduled dates. There was a van parked in the alley, unmarked and plain. Two men were carrying something heavy through the side door, wrapped in a dark sheet. I didn't stop. I didn't want them to see me watching. But as I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of one of the men's faces. He was wearing an apron, clean and white. His expression was blank, his eyes fixed on the ground as he moved. There was no urgency, no sign of emotion, just cold precision. I haven't gone back since. But sometimes late at night I check the obituaries and wonder whose names are being added to that clipboard now. And I wonder how long it will be before one of them is mine. Story 7. I found the room listed online late one night. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't think much of it. The photo showed a small, furnished room in an old house, and the owner claimed it was quiet and private. I sent a message, got a fast reply, and arranged to move in the next day. The house was tucked away on a quiet street, a little run down but not terrible. The landlord was an older man who didn't say much. He handed me the keys and told me to stay quiet after dark, because the walls were thin. I nodded, thinking nothing of it, and carried my things inside. The room was basic, with an old twin bed, a small desk, and a dresser. There was a single window that faced the side yard, but the blinds were stuck halfway down. The lock on the door was flimsy, but I figured it was better than nothing. I set my bags down, unpacked a few things, and lay on the bed for a while, listening to the quiet creaks of the house settling. That first night, I fell asleep quickly. The place was silent except for the occasional hum of traffic in the distance. Sometime in the middle of the night, though, I woke woke up suddenly. It was the kind of waking where you don't know why you're awake, but you can't fall back asleep. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, until I noticed something on the floor by the door. At first, I thought it was just a piece of paper someone had slipped under by mistake. But when I got up and turned on the light, I saw they were Polaroid pictures. There were 3 of them, all of me. The first showed me sleeping, turned on my side. The second was closer, showing my face in more detail. The third was right up close, the frame filled with just my closed eyes and part of my cheek. I stared at them for a long time, my mind struggling to make sense of it. I was alone in that room. I'd locked the door. There was no one else, but someone had taken these pictures. Someone had been in the room, standing close enough to touch me, and I hadn't felt a thing. I grabbed the photos and paced the room, trying to keep calm. I opened the door and looked down the hallway. It was empty and dark, the faint glow of a nightlight flickering from the far end. I thought about knocking on the landlord's door, but stopped myself. I didn't want to explain why I was up in the middle of the night holding photos of myself sleeping. I checked the lock again. It was still latched, but that didn't mean much. The house was old. Maybe there was another way in. I checked the window, but it was stuck shut, and I was on the 2nd floor anyway. There weren't any vents large enough for someone to crawl through. I was running out of explanations. I ended up sitting in the corner of the room with my back to the wall, holding the photos. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting for the sound of footsteps or a creaking floorboard. Nothing happened. The house was silent, but the silence didn't make me feel any better. When morning came, I took the photos and left the room, walking down to the kitchen. The landlord was sitting at the table, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. He glanced at me and gave a polite nod. I wanted to ask him if he'd seen anyone in the house last night, but the words stuck in my throat. I spent the day out, walking aimlessly through the city. I thought about getting a hotel room or calling a friend, but my money was tight, and I'd already paid for the week. I told myself I'd just lock the door, stay alert, and get through it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe there was some explanation I hadn't thought of yet. That night, I barricaded the door with the desk and a chair wedged under the knob. I double-checked the window and even stuffed a towel under the gap at the bottom of the door. I left the light on and sat in bed with my back against the wall, waiting. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I started to drift off, thinking maybe I was overreacting. I woke up again just after 3 in the morning. There was a faint sound like paper sliding over wood. I snapped awake and looked toward the door. Another set of Polaroids was there. This time there were 5. They showed me sitting in bed, eyes closed, head tilted back against the wall. In one of them, I could see the edge of a hand in the corner of the frame, as if whoever took the picture hadn't moved away in time. My chest tightened, and I jumped up, throwing the desk and chair aside. I yanked the door open and looked down the hallway. Empty. Completely silent. I ran downstairs, not caring if I woke anyone up. The landlord's room was dark. I pounded on the door, shouting, but no one answered. It was like he wasn't there at all. I didn't go back upstairs. I left the house with nothing but my backpack and walked until I found an all-night diner. I sat there until the sun came up, drinking coffee and watching the door. I called a friend that morning and begged them to let me crash on their couch. They didn't ask questions. They just said yes. Later that day, I went back for my things. The house looked empty. No cars out front. No sign of the landlord. I grabbed my bags, left the key on the table, and walked out without looking back. A week later, I checked the listing online. It was gone. No trace of it. Like it had never been there at all. Story 8. The old subway station had been shut down for decades. Most people in the city had forgotten it was even there, tucked beneath layers of modern lines and construction. I found it by accident while looking through some old city maps in the library. The idea of exploring a forgotten place like that stayed with me for days until I finally gave in to curiosity. I went one evening, just as the sun was starting to set. The entrance was hidden behind a boarded-up maintenance door on an alley no one used anymore. I pried the boards loose and stepped inside, using my flashlight to guide me down the crumbling stairs. The air smelled of mold and rust, and every step echoed in the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the station platform. It was coated in dust and grime, the walls cracked, and the old tiles falling away. A few broken benches lined the sides, and an ancient ticket booth stood empty, its glass smashed long ago. The place felt abandoned but not empty, as if something still lingered in the shadows, waiting. I made my way down the platform, my boots scuffing against the concrete. The tunnel at the far end of the station yawned open, black and endless. I hesitated, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. Just a faint drip of water somewhere deep within the tunnel. I clicked my flashlight to a brighter setting and started walking. The tunnel stretched on farther than I expected. The old rails were still there, rusted and broken in places. Graffiti covered the walls in strange, twisted shapes I couldn't quite make sense of. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. It felt wrong, like the temperature had dropped suddenly without reason. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it. A small door built into the tunnel wall, half hidden behind a rusted maintenance sign. It wasn't on any map I'd seen, and the way it was placed made me think it was never meant to be found. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling the rough metal beneath my fingers. Without thinking, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow passage that led into a cramped room. My flashlight beam swept over the walls, and that's when I saw them. Dolls. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Each one had been pinned to the wall with long, rusty nails driven through their limbs and torsos. Their plastic eyes stared blankly forward, cracked and yellowed with age. I stepped inside, unable to stop myself. Some of the dolls had old-fashioned clothes torn and stained. Others were newer, but just as damaged. Each one had been arranged with eerie precision, as if whoever placed them there had a clear purpose. The air in the room smelled sharp and metallic, a scent that made the back of my throat sting. I moved the flashlight slowly across the walls, noting that every doll was positioned as if in some kind of pattern. Their arms and legs formed angles and shapes that didn't make sense. In the center of the room was a chair. On it sat a single doll, larger than the rest. It had nails driven through its eyes and mouth, its head tilted slightly to the side. A thick layer of dust coated its face, but underneath, I could see faint smears of something darker. I took a step closer, my foot crunching on something brittle. Looking down, I saw small bones scattered across the floor, mixed with broken doll parts and bits of cloth. My pulse hammered in my ears as I realized they weren't just animal bones. Some were too small. Some were too human. I forced myself to back away, but something about the doll in the chair held me there. Its head seemed to move slightly as I shined the light on it. I told myself it was just a trick of the shadows, but I wasn't sure. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. There was a noise behind me, a soft scraping sound like nails dragged across concrete. I spun around, flashlight jerking wildly in my hand, but the passage was empty. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't behind me. It was coming from the walls. I turned the light back to the dolls. Some of them were different now. Their arms had shifted. Their heads had turned. Their blank eyes stared straight at me, and I felt a cold chill run up my spine, I stepped backward toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Then the doll in the chair fell forward. It hit the floor with a dull thud, its limbs twitching as if something moved inside it. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, stumbling out of the room and back into the tunnel. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die, but I didn't stop moving. The tunnel felt longer on the way back, as if the darkness was pulling me deeper instead of letting me go. I kept running, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the ache in my legs. I didn't stop until I reached the station platform again, and even then I didn't look back. When I burst out of the maintenance door and into the night air, I collapsed on the ground, gasping. The city lights seemed too bright, too clean compared to what I'd just seen. I never told anyone about that room or what I found inside it, but sometimes when I close my eyes I can still see those dolls staring at me. And I can still hear that faint scraping sound getting closer. Story 9. The hotel was older than any place I'd ever stayed before. Its wide brick facade loomed over the narrow street, and ivy crept along the edges of its windows. The woman at the front desk smiled politely as she handed me the key, the heavy brass tag clinking as it swung from the ring. She told me the building had been standing since the late 1800s, and many of the original fixtures were still in use. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the very end of a long hallway where the wallpaper curled in the corners. The floorboards creaked under my steps, and the brass key turned with some effort in the lock. Inside, the room smelled faintly of old wood and something older that I couldn't quite place. The furniture was heavy, dark, and polished to a dull sheen. A tall window overlooked the street below, but the thick curtains blocked most of the light. I didn't mind the odd feeling at first. The place was historic after all. I put my bag down on the small bed and explored the room for a few minutes. There was a writing desk in the corner, an empty wardrobe with a cracked mirror on its door, and a side table that held a dusty lamp. The bathroom was small but clean enough. Everything seemed ordinary until the knocking started. It was faint at first, just 3 slow taps on the door. I assumed it was someone from housekeeping, or maybe another guest. When I opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the carpeted floor silent and still. I stepped out and looked both ways, but saw no sign of anyone. I went back inside and locked the door again. Maybe it was just the sounds of the old building settling. I lay down on the bed and tried to relax. An hour passed. Then there was another knock. 3 sharp raps, a little louder this time. I sat up, heart beating faster, and listened for footsteps. There were none. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. I stood there for a few seconds before turning the knob and pulling the door open. Again, there was no one in the hallway. But this time, something was different. A knife was stuck into the wood just above the handle. A piece of yellowed paper was pinned beneath it, the handwriting thin and uneven. It read, 2 hours left. I pulled the note free with shaking hands. The hallway was still empty, and I felt exposed standing there, so I shut the door and locked it again. My mind raced through every possibility. Someone was playing a sick joke, or maybe it was a leftover prank from some ghost tour. But deep down, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt serious. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The Wisconsin 5 wasn't working either. I thought about going downstairs to the front desk, but something made me stay put. I slid the bolt across the door and propped one of the heavy chairs under the knob. Then I turned off the lights and sat on the bed, waiting. Another hour passed slowly. Every creak in the walls made me jump. The old radiator clicked loudly, and somewhere far off I thought I heard faint footsteps. I kept staring at the door, at the spot where the knife had been. At exactly the next hour, there was another knock. 3 times, louder than before, like whoever was out there was getting impatient. I didn't move this time. I stayed frozen on the bed, barely breathing. I watched the shadow under the door but saw nothing move. The knocking stopped, and everything was silent again. I thought about the note. 2 hours left. I didn't know what was supposed to happen when time ran out, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. The minutes dragged on. I kept checking the old clock on the wall, watching the hands crawl toward the hour. As it neared the 2nd hour, I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, like metal dragging lightly across wood. It was coming from the door. I didn't dare move. I stayed still, listening, while the sound continued slowly along the doorframe. I glanced at the window. It was stuck tight, painted shut years ago. There was no fire escape, no way out except through the door. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to think of what I would do if someone broke in. My phone was still useless, and the room didn't have a phone of its own. Then the knocking came again. This time it was rapid, hard, pounding against the door so forcefully the wood rattled in its frame. I stood up, backing toward the far corner of the room, my hands shaking. The chair under the knob shifted slightly with each blow, but the door held. After a few seconds, the pounding stopped. I stood there in the dark, listening, waiting for the next sound. Instead, there was only silence. It stretched on so long I wondered if the person or whatever it was had gone. I forced myself to approach the door again, keeping quiet, pressing my ear gently to the wood. I heard breathing, slow, heavy breathing, inches from the other side. I backed away, grabbing my bag and looking for anything I could use to defend myself. There was nothing useful in the room, nothing that made me feel safer. I watched the clock. The 2 hours were almost up. I kept glancing at the door, wondering what would happen at the exact moment the time ended. When the minute hand hit the hour, the breathing stopped. Everything went silent again. I waited, not daring to move. Then, without warning, the knife slid through the gap at the bottom of the door. It scraped across the floor and stopped in the middle of the room, the blade glinting faintly in the dark. I stared at it, frozen. My heart pounded in my chest. Slowly I reached down and picked it up. On the blade, carved into the metal, were the words "Time's Up." I dropped it immediately and ran to the window, pounding on the glass, screaming for help. By morning the door was unlocked, and the hallway was empty. When the staff found me, I was still sitting by the window, too shaken to speak. I left that morning and never went back. But sometimes I dream about the knocking, and I wake up expecting to find a knife waiting for me. Story 10. The decommissioned military base sat about 30 miles outside of town, tucked behind dense forests and stretches of empty highway. It had been shut down for years, and most people avoided it. Stories floated around about classified experiments and disappearances, but no one ever proved anything. I wasn't out there looking for proof, though. I just wanted to explore something different and maybe snap a few eerie photos for fun. I parked my car by the old perimeter fence, which had long since rusted away in places. The air smelled stale, and the wind rattled through skeletal trees. As I climbed over the fence, I noticed how quiet it was, like the place absorbed every sound. The buildings loomed ahead, long and gray, their windows empty and black. It took a few minutes to find a clear path to one of the bunkers. The entrance to the bunker was half covered in dirt and vines. I pushed some debris aside and slipped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was cooler underground, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rust. The walls were lined with peeling paint and old signs, warning of restricted access and high security. My footsteps echoed softly as I moved deeper. I passed through a few empty rooms first, filled with rusted metal tables and broken equipment. Most of it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But then I reached a corridor where things seemed different. The dust on the floor wasn't thick like the rest of the place. There were faint marks, like something had been dragged across the concrete not long ago. At the end of the hall, I found a heavy door slightly ajar. It groaned as I pushed it open, the sound sharp and quiet. Inside was a small room, lit only by the thin beam of my flashlight. Along one wall, there were shelves stacked with boxes and old files, but it was the pile in the center of the room that stopped me cold. It was a neat stack of ID badges. I stepped closer and crouched down, shining my light over them. The faces stared up at me from plastic covers, each one smiling in that stiff way people do in official photos. I picked up one badge, then another. They all had different names, different places of employment, and different professions. What made my stomach twist was the dates printed beneath their names. I recognized them immediately. They were the same dates listed in missing persons reports I had read about in the news over the past few months. Not a single badge was older than 6 months. Some were only a few weeks old. I kept going through the pile, hoping there was some explanation. But there wasn't. Each one told the same story, a person who had vanished without a trace. Their last known location sometimes states away from here. The realization hit me that these people had no connection. No reason to all end up in a forgotten bunker at an abandoned military site. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. My breathing grew shallow as I stood up and backed toward the door. That's when I noticed the camera in the corner of the ceiling, its red light faint but steady. Someone was watching, or had been. It was hard to tell if the system still worked, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I slipped back into the hallway and moved fast, my pulse pounding in my ears. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving quietly, but every time my foot scuffed the ground, it sounded too loud. I thought I heard something, then footsteps, slow and deliberate, somewhere deeper in the bunker. I reached the entrance, scrambling up the slope of dirt and vines. The air outside was sharp in my lungs, and for a second, I stood there listening. The forest was still quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I jogged back toward the fence, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The road stayed clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the trees. When I got home, I locked my doors and closed the blinds. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every little sound made me sit up, listening for something that wasn't there. A few days later, I checked the news again. Another person had gone missing. This one had disappeared from a gas station 2 towns over. I recognized their face instantly. It was one of the badges I had seen at the bunker. Their name was burned into my memory now, along with all the others. I debated telling someone, the police maybe, but how could I explain what I found without sounding crazy? And if someone was still using that bunker, I wasn't sure I wanted them knowing I had been there. The camera's red light kept flashing in my mind, and I wondered if they had seen me, if they knew who I was. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget about it, but every time another person vanished from the news, I thought about that pile of badges, about how many more would be added to it, and about whether my face would end up in that stack one day, my name on a tag, waiting in the dark under that bunker. Story 11. It was getting late by the time I decided to pull off the highway. I'd been driving for hours, and the endless stretch of empty road was starting to wear on me. When I saw the flickering neon sign for a roadside motel, I figured it was better than falling asleep behind the wheel. The place looked worn down, but the old man behind the counter gave me a key without asking many questions. The room was on the second floor, overlooking the cracked parking lot. Inside, it smelled faintly of mildew, but it was clean enough. I dropped my bag on the bed and sat down, stretching my legs. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the lamp on the nightstand flickered a few times before staying on. As I unpacked, I noticed the closet door. It was slightly ajar, its white paint chipped and stained in places. When I moved closer, I saw scratches running up and down the inside of the door. They were deep, gouged into the wood like someone had clawed at it with desperate hands. Some were thin like fingernails, while others were wider, as if made with a tool. Curious and uneasy, I pulled the door open wider. There was nothing inside except an old coat hanger swaying slightly as if it had just been disturbed. I reached in and ran my fingers over the scratches. They felt rough, the splinters sharp enough to prick my skin if I pressed too hard. At the back of the closet, tucked into the corner, was a small, leather-bound book. It was dusty, but when I picked it up, the leather was soft and warm, like it had been handled recently. I carried it over to the bed and sat down, wiping off the cover. There was no title, just a few faint stains. I opened it and began to read. The handwriting was hurried, jagged in places as if written in a rush or under stress. The first few pages were dated about 6 months earlier. The entries started out normal enough notes about traveling through the area, staying at this motel for a night to rest before continuing on. But as I turned the pages, the tone changed. The writer mentioned hearing things at night, whispering voices outside the door, footsteps pacing just beyond the walls. They wrote about how they couldn't sleep, how they felt watched every time they closed their eyes. Then there was an entry where they described someone knocking on the door. When they answered it, no one was there. A few pages later, they described waking up inside the closet. They didn't know how they got there, but the door was shut tight from the outside. They wrote about pounding on it until their hands bled, screaming for help and hearing nothing in return. The entries grew frantic after that, describing hours turning into days. No food, no water, just the darkness and the sound of their own breathing. As I read, a chill crept over me. The last entry was written in shaky, almost illegible script. It simply said, "If someone finds this, don't trust him." There was no name, no explanation of who him was. I closed the diary and sat there for a long time, staring at the closet door. I told myself it was probably a prank or someone's twisted idea of a joke. But the scratches inside the closet told a different story. They looked real, desperate. I decided I wasn't going to stay in that room any longer. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. When I stepped out onto the balcony, the motel was silent. Too silent. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the soft buzzing of the neon sign below. As I made my way down the stairs, I glanced back up at my room. The closet door was still open, but it looked darker inside than it should have. I reached the front desk, hoping to return the key and leave quietly, but the lobby was empty. The old man who had checked me in was gone. The chair behind the counter was pushed back like he'd stood up in a hurry. I waited a moment, calling out a hello, but no one answered. There was a book on the counter, similar to the one I'd found in the room. I flipped it open and saw page after page of names and dates. Each name was crossed out with a thick black line. My name was the last one, written in neat, careful letters with today's date next to it. It wasn't crossed out yet. I left the key on the counter and hurried out to my car. The parking lot seemed darker than before, and I fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror. The motel stood there, silent and empty, its neon sign flickering until it finally went dark. That night, I found another motel farther down the highway. I didn't sleep much. The closet stayed open, and I left the light on. Every creak of the walls made my skin crawl. The diary stayed in my bag, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Even now, I wonder about that place, about who it was, and why my name was written in that book. I haven't gone back, and I never will. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, sure I can hear faint scratching on the inside of the closet door. Story 12. The slaughterhouse had been abandoned for nearly 30 years, or so I was told. Its rusted exterior loomed at the end of an overgrown road, hidden behind trees that had crept closer over time. I had passed by it more times than I could count, but never worked up the nerve to go inside until that afternoon. Curiosity mixed with a strange sense of dread led me to push open the heavy metal doors. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of rust, rot, and something faintly metallic that clung to the back of my throat. The floor was slick with old grime, and the faint sound of dripping echoed from deep within the building. My boots left faint tracks in the dust, and I could see where others had walked before me, though I was sure no one had been here for years. The silence was dense, broken only by the steady creak of the structure as it settled around me. I passed rows of rusted meat hooks hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly though there was no breeze. Old conveyor belts lay silent and stiff, their surfaces cracked and brittle from age. The walls were stained dark in places where time hadn't been enough to fade what had once been there. I kept walking, holding my breath without realizing it, until I reached a door marked office. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the hinges groaned loudly in protest. The room inside was small, lined with broken shelves and old filing cabinets tipped on their sides. A desk sat in the center of the space, its surface covered in thick dust. On top of it lay an old ledger, its leather cover cracked but intact. I reached out slowly, brushing the dust away to reveal the word processing embossed on the front. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, the pages yellowed but legible. Names were written in neat, careful handwriting. Each one was followed by a weight and a date. The first few entries seemed old, some from decades ago, but then I turned to the back pages. The dates shifted, becoming more recent. Then I found entries marked for the following month. The handwriting was the same, steady and deliberate. The names were unfamiliar, but one of them matched mine. My weight was listed exactly. My name was written on a line with a date only 2 weeks away. I shut the ledger quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. A cold sweat broke out along my spine as I backed away from the desk. My mind raced, trying to explain how it could be there, how someone would know I'd be standing in this room, looking at this page. I told myself it was a mistake, a coincidence, but it didn't feel like either. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer when I wasn't looking. I glanced at the filing cabinets, noticing they weren't empty after all. Some drawers hung open just enough for me to see folders stuffed with photographs and more names. I didn't dare look closer. I just needed to leave. As I turned back toward the door, I heard a soft scraping sound coming from the hallway. It was slow and deliberate, metal dragging against concrete. My breath hitched as I stood frozen, listening. Another scrape followed, closer this time. I couldn't see anything through the gap in the doorway, but I knew something was there. I crept toward the doorway, trying to make as little sound as possible. When I finally dared to look out, the hallway was empty. But the sound came again, from further down the corridor where the meat hooks hung. I didn't wait to see what was making it. I slipped out of the office and moved quickly toward the exit. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence, and the scraping sound quickened behind me. I didn't look back. I focused on the faint outline of the door where I had entered, willing myself to reach it before whatever followed got any closer. The metal doors stood just ahead, and I reached for the handle with a shaky hand. The door didn't budge at first. It felt welded shut by time and rust. Panic surged as I yanked at it again, harder this time. It gave with a shriek, and I stumbled out into the daylight, slamming it closed behind me. I stood there, chest heaving, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't wait. I ran back down the overgrown road, not stopping until the slaughterhouse was out of sight. Even then, I didn't slow down. My car was parked just beyond the tree-line, and I fumbled the keys trying to unlock it with shaking hands. When I finally got inside and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, staring back toward the direction I had come from. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the ledger, about my name written in it. I told myself it had to be a sick joke or some forgotten relic of the past. But deep down I knew better. The handwriting was too careful, too recent. Whoever wrote it had been waiting for me. A week passed, and I avoided going anywhere alone. But then I started noticing things. My phone would ring, and no one would answer on the other end. I'd see the same car parked across the street from my apartment, engine running but headlights off. The feeling of being watched never left. 2 weeks from the day I found the ledger, I packed my things and planned to leave town. But on the morning of my departure, I found an envelope tucked under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with my name, weight, and the words "processing today" written neatly across the center. I left immediately, driving for hours without stopping. I don't know if it's far enough. Sometimes at night, I hear the faint sound of metal scraping against concrete, even when I'm alone in a motel room miles away. I haven't gone back, but I know someone is still keeping track. Story 13. The old textile mill had been closed for over 50 years. I'd driven past it countless times on my way to work. Its windows broken, the brickwork crumbling. People said it was dangerous to go inside, but curiosity had been gnawing at me for months. One overcast afternoon, I finally decided to see it for myself. I found an opening in the chain-link fence and ducked through. Weeds and vines tangled around my legs as I crossed the yard toward a side door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, the smell was thick with mildew and rust, and the air felt colder than it should have. My boots crunched across glass and bits of plaster as I moved deeper into the building. The mill floor was wide open, its machinery long gone, leaving only rust-stained marks on the concrete where they once stood. Sunlight streamed through shattered windows, catching dust motes that swirled in the air. It was quieter than I expected. Even my footsteps seemed muffled. I took my time walking through rooms littered with old spools, scraps of cloth, and rotting wooden crates. I was about to leave when I noticed something strange in one corner of the room. The wall didn't quite match the others. It was smoother, newer, like it had been patched up hastily. I ran my hand along it and found a seam almost invisible. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this section wasn't part of the original construction. It took some effort, but I managed to wedge my fingers into the gap and pull. The false wall groaned, stiff with age, and swung open just enough for me to squeeze through. Behind it was a narrow passage, darker and colder than the rest of the mill. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside, my heart beating faster with each step. At the end of the passage was a small room. The smell hit me immediately, old sweat, mildew, and something sour underneath it all. The concrete floor was stained in places, and there was a single dirty mattress lying in one corner. Thick metal chains were bolted to the walls, the ends looped through heavy iron rings. The leather cuffs attached to them were cracked, but still looked strong enough to hold someone. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no doubt about what this room had been used for. It wasn't a place for storage, or an office someone had forgotten. This was deliberate. Someone had built this space for a specific, awful purpose. On the far side of the room was a battered metal cabinet. Its door was slightly ajar. I crossed to it slowly, every instinct telling me to leave but unable to make myself turn back. Inside, there were several old journals stacked neatly on the shelves. They were covered in dust, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. I picked up the first one and flipped it open. The handwriting was precise, almost neat, but the words made my stomach twist. It wasn't a diary or a work log like I expected. These were instructions. Pages upon pages of detailed methods for breaking people down. Training methods, the author called them. Descriptions of how to control someone through deprivation, how to manipulate pain and reward, how to erase a person's will entirely. There were diagrams in the margin, sketches of restraints, drawings of different positions, and what I guessed were punishment tools. Every page was numbered, indexed like a manual. It was clinical in tone, as if whoever wrote it saw this as a process, not something horrific. As I read, it became clear these weren't just hypothetical ideas. The entries referenced specific people's subjects by number, and there were notes about their reactions, their breaking points. I put the journal back on the shelf and stepped away, feeling sick. My flashlight shook a little in my hand as I swept it around the room again. I noticed deep scratches on the walls near the mattress, as if someone had clawed at the concrete in desperation. There were dark stains on the floor beneath where the chains hung slack. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me. I could almost imagine someone still being in those cuffs, still struggling, still screaming. The silence around me was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I forced myself to back out of the room, not daring to turn around until I was back in the larger part of the mill. I closed the false wall behind me as best I could, my hands clammy against the cold concrete. It didn't sit right, and I could still see the faint seam, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way back to the exit, I kept thinking about who had built that room and who they had used it on. Outside, the air smelled different, cleaner, but I still felt like something clung to me. I didn't stop walking until I was back at my car, and even then, my hands trembled as I unlocked the door. On the drive home, I couldn't stop replaying the details from those journals in my head. The descriptions, the methods, the way they stripped people of everything that made them human. I never told anyone about what I found in that mill. I should have, but something about it made me afraid to speak. I told myself I'd forget about it eventually, that it would fade like a bad dream. But it hasn't. Some nights when it's quiet, I still hear the faint clatter of chains in the dark, and I wonder if someone ever really left that room. Story 14. The estate sale had been advertised in the local paper, promising antiques and rare collectibles. I wasn't usually one for these kinds of things, but something about the description caught my attention. It was being held in an old mansion on the edge of town, one I had always assumed was abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see what treasures might be hidden inside. When I arrived, the place looked even more impressive up close. Tall, arched windows lined the front, their panes clouded with age. The paint was peeling from the wooden siding, and vines had crept their way up the stone foundation. Despite its condition, there was a line of people waiting at the entrance, all eager to get inside. The inside of the house was cooler than I expected, a faint draft moving through the high-ceilinged rooms. There was an odd smell in the air, something metallic and faintly sweet, though I couldn't quite place it. Tables were set up in the main parlor, filled with jewelry, silverware, and dusty books. People moved from room to room, quietly murmuring over the items they found. I wandered for a while, sifting through old portraits and trinkets, but nothing held my interest for long. Eventually, I found myself at the back of the house where a narrow staircase led down to the basement. There was a sign propped against the wall that read, "Additional items below." My curiosity pushed me to follow the stairs down into the dark. The basement smelled damp, the walls slick with moisture. A single hanging bulb lit the stairwell, but beyond that, it was dim. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, most of them filled with dusty boxes and crates. At first, it seemed like a typical storage area, but then I noticed something strange. One of the shelves was perfectly organized, unlike the clutter everywhere else. Glass jars were arranged in neat rows, each one labeled with a strip of yellowing paper. I moved closer, squinting to read the labels. Male age 6, female age 12, male age 34. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as I realized each jar was filled with human teeth. They weren't just random teeth either. Each jar was full to the brim, sorted by size and color, and they gleamed unnaturally in the flashlight beam. Some of the labels had dates as well, spanning back decades. I counted the jars as I walked along the shelf. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Each one marked with clinical precision, as if whoever had done this had treated it like a collection. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how quiet the basement was. The sounds from upstairs were distant now, muffled as if by thick walls. My breathing seemed loud in the stillness. I thought about leaving then, but something made me stay a moment longer. There was a small cabinet at the far end of the room that stood apart from the shelves. I approached it slowly, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The cabinet doors creaked when I opened them, revealing another row of jars, but these were different. Each jar contained something other than teeth, small bones, neatly arranged finger joints, and a few that held what looked like preserved eyes floating in murky liquid. The labels on these were even more detailed, listing names alongside the ages. My skin crawled as I read a few of the names, wondering if they had ever been reported missing. I took a step back, heart pounding, when I heard something faint behind me. It was a soft creak, like a footstep on an old wooden stair. I spun around, flashlight beam darting toward the staircase, but there was nothing there. I held my breath, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there anymore. I backed away from the cabinet, moving toward the stairs without turning my light away from the room. Every jar on those shelves seemed to glint in the dim light as I passed them, like watching eyes. When I reached the stairwell, I bolted up the steps 2 at a time. The door at the top was closed, though I was sure it had been open when I went down. I yanked it hard, and it opened with a reluctant groan. On the other side, the house seemed empty. The people who had been browsing the sale were nowhere in sight. I walked quickly toward the front door, glancing into each room as I passed. Chairs were overturned, and a few tables had been knocked over, as if people had left in a hurry. The house was silent. The only sound my footsteps on the wooden floors. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the overgrown lawn in the cold air. Looking back at the house, I half expected to see someone standing in a window, watching me, but the windows were empty, dark behind their dusty panes. I didn't wait around to see if anything else would happen. I got in my car and drove away, not stopping until I was well out of town. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about those jars and the names on those labels. I checked the local news, but there was no mention of the estate sale or anything found at the house. It was as if it had never happened. Still, I sometimes dream about that basement, and when I do, I hear footsteps coming up behind me in the dark. Story 15. The ghost town was exactly how we imagined it would be: silent, sun-bleached, and crumbling at the edges. Dust swirled in the wind as we walked down what used to be the main street. Most of the wooden buildings leaned precariously, their windows empty and dark. My friend Alex and I had been talking about exploring this place for months, and now that we were here, the quiet pressed down on us more than we expected. We wandered for a while, checking out the old general store and a saloon that still had broken bottles on the floor. Everything felt frozen in time, as if the people had left in a hurry but never returned. There was no sign of animals or other people, just the creaking wood and our footsteps crunching on gravel. Alex kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be watching us. Eventually, we came to a house on the edge of town. It was a little larger than the others and mostly intact, with its door still hanging straight on its hinges. The paint was peeled away, and the glass in the windows was long gone. We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying anything, until Alex shrugged and said we might as well check it out. The floor creaked under our boots as we stepped inside. The air inside the house was stale and smelled faintly of mold. Sunlight filtered through the empty windows and dusty beams. Most of the rooms were empty, except for broken furniture and shattered glass. We kept moving from room to room, each one feeling heavier than the last. It wasn't until we found the door at the end of the hallway that things took a different turn. It was closed, but when Alex pushed it open, the hinges barely made a sound. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned up in rows, some overlapping each other. They weren't old photos, though. These were recent. We stepped closer, trying to understand what we were seeing. In the pictures, there we were, Alex and I, arriving in town earlier that afternoon. Some were taken from behind broken windows, others from rooftops or doorways. There were shots of us standing by my car, unpacking our backpacks. Others showed us walking along the dirt road, looking at buildings, even talking to each other. Every angle was covered, as if someone had been following us and snapping pictures the entire time. My stomach dropped as I recognized the exact moment captured in one of them. It was from less than 20 minutes ago, when I tied my bootlace in front of the saloon. The angle of the shot was from inside the saloon, looking out through a window I thought was empty. Alex whispered that we needed to leave, his voice tight. I nodded, unable to take my eyes off the photographs. Then I noticed something else. There were other pictures too, not just of us. Different people in different seasons, some wearing winter coats, others in summer clothes. Some of them were walking through town like we had been, exploring with cautious curiosity. But in a few photos they were running, faces twisted in panic mid-sprint, and in some they were caught held down by figures I couldn't quite make out. We backed out of the room quickly, but before we reached the front door we heard a sound upstairs. A slow, steady creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. Alex grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door, but I hesitated just a second too long. The sound of footsteps was coming closer, deliberate and heavy. We bolted out of the house, kicking up dust as we ran down the street toward where we parked the car. I didn't look back until we were almost there, and when I did, I caught sight of a figure standing in the doorway of the house we had just left. They didn't move, just stood there watching us. I couldn't make out a face, only the shape of a tall, thin person who didn't seem in any hurry to follow. We jumped into the car and locked the doors, breathing hard. Alex fumbled with the keys, and for a terrible moment they slipped from his hand and fell onto the floor. He grabbed them again, started the engine, and we tore out of town as fast as the dirt road would allow. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something move along the rooftops, keeping pace with us. But when we turned the last corner, it vanished. We drove for hours without stopping, too shaken to speak much. Eventually, we found a motel in a nearby town and checked in, saying nothing to the man behind the counter who asked if we were just passing through. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photographs pinned to the walls. I could still feel the weight of whoever had been watching us. The next morning, Alex wanted to drive straight home, but I convinced him to stop by the town's little library first. I needed to know if anyone else had ever seen that place, if anyone had disappeared after visiting. There wasn't much information. A few old articles about the ghost town's mining days, nothing recent. No mention of other explorers or missing persons. Just a note in one book about how the town was abandoned suddenly, with no real explanation why. We left soon after that. Neither of us ever talked about going back. Sometimes I think about those photographs again, especially the ones of the people running. I wonder if anyone ever found pictures of us on those walls later. And sometimes I wake up at night, sure I can hear a camera shutter clicking in the dark. Story 16. I found the old logging cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't on any map, but a local hiker told me about it when I asked for quiet places to spend a night. The cabin was a simple structure, weathered but sturdy, sitting alone beneath towering pines. Its door creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for someone to come inside. The interior was dark and musty, with thick dust coating everything. A single cot rested in the corner, and an old wood-burning stove stood rusted against the far wall. The windows were grimy, letting in little light, but enough to make out strange markings carved into the wooden walls. Curious, I stepped closer and brushed the dust away to get a better look. Names. Dozens of them, each carved neatly in a long column, alongside dates that stretched back nearly 100 years. Some were as old as the early 1900s, others as recent as 5 or 6 years ago. Almost every name had an X slashed over it, deep and ragged, as if someone had done it in a hurry. I scanned down the list, feeling unsettled, until I found my own name near the bottom. It was freshly carved. The wood was pale and raw compared to the darker, aged names above it. The date next to my name was today's date. There was no X over mine yet. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't carved it. No one had been with me. I'd been alone the entire hike in. The logical part of me tried to reason it out. Maybe the hiker who told me about the place had come ahead and done it. Maybe it was a prank. But I hadn't told him my last name, and there it was, carved perfectly. The thought that someone had been following me, watching me without my knowledge, made my skin crawl. I decided to leave. I grabbed my pack and headed for the door, but when I opened it, the woods outside had changed. The path I'd taken in was gone. In its place was dense underbrush that hadn't been disturbed in years. The trees pressed in closer than they had before, their branches blocking out the fading light. I shut the door and tried to calm myself. Maybe I was turned around. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. I told myself I'd wait until morning and try again in the daylight. The cot creaked under my weight as I sat down, keeping my eyes on the carved names. I couldn't stop staring at the list, waiting to see if something would change. As night settled in, the woods outside grew unnervingly quiet. Not a single insect or animal sound drifted through the walls. It was as if everything out there had stopped moving, listening instead. I lit one of my small lanterns and placed it near the wall so I could watch the names more clearly. The flickering light made the X marks look fresh, as though they'd been cut only moments ago. I lay down but didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the building, pausing now and then beneath the window. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot, or something brushing lightly against the walls. I stayed completely still, heart racing, listening for the sound of the door handle turning. Hours passed. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke with a start. The lantern had gone out. Pale morning light was filtering through the grime-covered windows. I sat up and looked immediately at the wall. My name was still there, still no X. Relief washed over me, but it was brief. I packed up quickly and opened the door again. This time the woods looked as they had when I first arrived. The path stretched out in front of me, clear and waiting. I stepped outside but glanced back at the cabin. I thought about the names and dates and wondered how many people had stood exactly where I was now, relieved to be leaving. As I turned to go, I noticed something new carved into the door frame. It was another list of names, shorter than the one inside. At the bottom, beneath the last name, was mine. And next to it, this time was an X. A deep one, freshly gouged into the wood. My stomach twisted, and I stumbled back from the door. I walked fast, almost running, not caring about the weight of my pack. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look back. I felt watched the entire way out of the woods, but when I finally reached the road and flagged down a car, no one was there. Nothing followed me out, but the feeling never left. Later that night at home, I pulled out my phone to look at the photos I'd taken. None of them were there. Every picture I thought I'd snapped of the cabin, the walls, and the carvings were gone. In their place were black images, just darkness. Except for one. It was a picture of me, asleep on the cot, taken from just a few feet away. In the background, on the wall behind me, was my name, and the X being carved slowly by a hand I didn't recognize. Story 17. It was a warm afternoon when I decided to go metal detecting in the hills about an hour outside town. The area wasn't marked on most maps, just a stretch of dense woods with faint signs of an old trail. I had read about a few people finding old coins and bits of scrap in places like this. The idea of uncovering something long forgotten pulled me in more than I wanted to admit. I parked my car on the side of a narrow dirt road and walked about half a mile into the woods. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird overhead. I set up my detector and swept it slowly across the ground, taking my time. The machine chirped here and there, mostly for junk, rusty nails, bits of metal, an old bottle cap. I kept at it for hours, slowly moving farther into the trees. When the detector gave a sharp, clear signal, I stopped. The tone was different, louder, more urgent. I marked the spot and started digging carefully with my trowel, peeling back layers of dirt and roots until the edge of something metallic appeared. It was a box, about the size of a shoebox, rusted but intact. The hinges were stiff, and for a minute I thought I might break them trying to open it. Eventually the lid creaked open, releasing a faint, musty smell. Inside, everything was packed neatly as if someone had taken their time placing it all. There were house keys, dozens of them, each on a ring with a small tag attached. Some had names written in faded ink, others just numbers. I picked up a handful and ran my thumb over their cold surfaces. The weight of them felt strange, heavier than keys should have felt. Beneath the keys were photographs, stacked together and bound with a rubber band so old it snapped as soon as I touched it. The photos were in color but faded, showing families standing in front of houses, smiling for the camera. Some pictures were older, judging by the clothes and hairstyles, but some were recent. One picture caught my attention, a woman and her daughter sitting on a porch I recognized. It was only a few blocks from my apartment. At the bottom of the box was a black notebook, its cover stained and worn soft by time. I flipped through it carefully. Each page was filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. Names and addresses filled the first few pages, each line followed by small details: what time they left for work, how long they stayed at the grocery store, when they walked their dog. The notes stretched over weeks, some months. There were names I recognized, neighbors, a guy I sometimes saw at the gas station. One entry mentioned the apartment complex I lived in, describing the schedules of people who lived on my floor. I felt my throat go dry as I read the times I usually left for work, the path I took on my evening walks. My name wasn't written, but I knew it was me. The longer I looked through the notebook, the more it felt like I was being watched. The woods had grown quiet, too quiet. I closed the book and put it back in the box, but I didn't bury it. I needed to get out of there. I stood up quickly and turned in a full circle, searching the trees for movement, but nothing was there. I carried the box back with me, my nerves on edge the entire time. Every snapping twig made me jump. When I finally reached the car, I shoved the box into the passenger seat and locked the doors as fast as I could. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the main road. At home, I spread everything out on the table, hoping the comfort of four walls would make things feel less strange. It didn't. I tried to convince myself it was all some elaborate prank or a collection left behind by someone long gone. But the photos were too recent, the details in the notebook too precise. Someone had been watching people, maybe still was. I called the police the next morning and handed everything over. They asked me all kinds of questions about where I found it and whether I had seen anyone out there. I told them the truth, every word of it. They said they would investigate, but I could tell they weren't sure what to make of it. For a while, things were quiet. I went back to work, tried to go about my life as usual. But every time I left my apartment, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Some nights I thought I heard footsteps in the hall outside my door, stopping when I got too close. Once, I found my mailbox hanging open even though I was sure I'd closed it. A few weeks later, the police called. They found fingerprints on some of the keys, matching a man who had been arrested years ago for stalking. But he was still in prison, had been the entire time the notebook entries were made. That's when they started to think there was someone else. I don't go metal detecting anymore. Sometimes when I pass that apartment with the porch from the photo, I wonder if those people ever knew they were being watched. I wonder if I was supposed to find that box or if someone was watching me when I did. I still checked the locks twice before bed, and I never walked the same route home 2 days in a row. Story 18. The church had stood empty for years, its tall spire looming over the edge of town like a shadow that never moved. When I heard they were asking for volunteers to help clean it out, I figured it would be a quiet way to spend the weekend. A few other people signed up, but by the time I arrived on Saturday morning, no one else had shown. The man who unlocked the door handed me a ring of keys and said he'd be back at sundown. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and something faintly metallic. The stained glass windows were cracked but still colored the light in streaks of red and blue. Rows of wooden pews stood in silent lines, some split and rotting, others strangely intact. I started with the broom, sweeping years of dirt and debris from the floor, working my way toward the altar at the front. The church was silent in a way that felt unnatural. Even when I moved, my steps seemed muffled. Every now and then, I thought I heard something shift behind me, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the old building settling as it warmed in the daylight. I made my way down one side of the nave, sweeping under the pews. That was when I saw it. Bolted to the floor beneath the wood was a thick iron shackle, its metal ring rusted but still solid. I stared at it for a moment, thinking maybe it was left over from something innocent. But when I moved to the next pew and found another one, and then another after that, the unease set in. There were manacles under almost every bench. They were spaced at regular intervals, as if each pew had once restrained multiple people. The floor beneath some of them was stained dark, and though the years had worn away the worst of it, I could still see smears and splashes where something had soaked deep into the grain. I told myself to stop looking, but I couldn't. I worked my way toward the front, my hands cold even though it was warm outside. When I reached the altar, I thought maybe I'd find something that would make sense of it all. Instead, I found more of the same. The altar itself was scarred with deep knife marks, gouges that had split the wood in long, jagged lines. Stains spread outward from the center, some dark and some a dull brown. I ran my fingers over one of the cuts without thinking, and the roughness of it made me pull back. It wasn't accidental damage. Someone had done this on purpose, and not just once. There was something carved into the side of the altar, half hidden beneath the edge. I leaned closer to read it, the letters crude but legible. They spelled out a single word, offering. My stomach twisted, and I stood up too fast, nearly stumbling backward down the steps. I told myself I needed to leave, but I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers, or maybe I was just frozen with the kind of fear that keeps you rooted in place. I walked behind the altar and found a door, smaller than I expected, leading down to a basement. The key fit the lock, and the door creaked open. The steps beyond were steep and narrow. I took out my phone to use its light, but the battery was almost dead. Still, the faint glow was enough to show me the way down. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of metal got stronger. At the bottom was a small stone room. Chains hung from the walls, most of them broken or rusted through. A heavy wooden table stood in the center, its surface stained much like the altar above. Knives lay scattered across it, their blades dulled by time but still sharp enough in places to catch the light. There were bones in one corner, stacked neatly. Some were small and some were far too large to ignore. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there staring at them. The longer I stood, the more I noticed. Symbols were painted on the walls, long faded but still faintly visible. Circles, spirals, things I didn't recognize. The sound behind me broke the silence. Soft at first, like fabric brushing against stone. I turned, holding up my phone's dim light. No one was there. But the chains on the far wall swayed slightly, as if someone had only just let them go. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed toward the stairs. As I moved, something shifted in the corner where the bones were piled. A hollow clatter, like bones settling or something disturbing them. I ran then, scrambling up the stairs two at a time, nearly tripping when my foot caught the edge of a step. I made it back into the sanctuary, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't stop to gather my things. I just ran down the center aisle toward the big double doors. They didn't budge. The keys I had didn't fit the lock on the inside. I pounded on the wood, shouted for help, but no one came. The only sound was the faint dragging scrape of something moving at the far end of the room. I turned, heart pounding in my ears. A figure stood near the altar now, its shape hard to make out in the gloom. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I tried the side doors next, rattling each handle, but they were all locked. My phone died as I moved, plunging everything into deeper shadow. The figure was closer when I turned again, standing between the pews. I backed away until I felt the cold iron of a manacle against my ankle. It clinked softly, a sound that seemed too loud in the silence. I didn't look away from the figure as it took one slow step toward me. At sundown, the man came back to unlock the door. The keys were still inside, lying in a neat pile on the floor. There was no sign of me, no sign of anything out of place. Only the faint clatter of a chain swaying slowly beneath a pew. Story 19. The old diner sat on the side of the highway, its sign leaning at a crooked angle, letters faded and barely legible. Most people didn't give it a second glance as they drove by. I had passed it a dozen times before curiosity finally got the better of me. One afternoon, with a storm rolling in and nothing better to do, I pulled over and decided to take a look inside. The windows were covered in grime, and the door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, it was dim, the only light coming from thin gaps in the boarded-up windows. Dust hung thick in the air, and every step I took stirred it up from the cracked tile floor. Old booths lined the walls, their cushions torn open like something had clawed at them. I moved toward the counter, running my fingers along its surface. There were stains that didn't look like they came from spilled coffee. A menu board still hung above the kitchen pass-through window, the letters faded but readable. The smell in the place was raw, damp, sour, and metallic all at once. The kitchen was surprisingly intact. Pans and utensils hung neatly on their hooks, though rust had claimed most of them. The burners on the stove were cold and dusty, and a few empty cans sat on the prep counter. Then I noticed the freezer door, slightly ajar, with a faint draft of cold air leaking out. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. The handle was sticky when I grabbed it, and a shiver ran down my spine. I pulled the door open fully and flicked on my flashlight. Inside were several black garbage bags stacked haphazardly like someone had been in a hurry. The cold air bit at my skin as I stepped inside. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached down and tugged at the knot of one of the bags, working it loose with my fingers numb from the cold. When it opened, the smell hit me first rotten, but not like spoiled meat. Inside were bones, clean to flesh but stained dark in places. Some were small, delicate. Others were unmistakably human. I backed out of the freezer quickly, breathing hard, wiping my hands on my jeans like I could scrub away the feeling. My flashlight beam wavered as my grip trembled. I glanced back at the bags, realizing there were at least half a dozen more, each one probably packed the same way. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned toward the walk-in fridge. It was closed, but the heavy latch hung loose, like it had been opened recently. I swallowed hard and stepped closer, pushing the door inward slowly. It swung open with a faint hiss, revealing a dim space inside. The first thing I saw were the chains. They hung from metal rings bolted into the walls, thick links ending in cuffs large enough for wrists or ankles. Some of them had old stains on them, dark and flaking. The floor was stained too, a rusty brown color that didn't look like it came from old food. The walls were scuffed and scratched, gouges cut deep into the metal panels, I stepped inside, feeling the cold seep into my skin, and ran my hand along one of the chains. It rattled softly in the still air, the sound making my stomach turn. Someone had been kept in here. More than one person, judging by the number of restraints. I backed out again, heart racing faster now. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't stop glancing around, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows. The place was dead silent, but it felt like I wasn't alone, like whoever had used this place wasn't far away. I made my way toward the back exit, ignoring the creaks in the floor and the way my flashlight beam flickered. The door was rusted, and I had to shove hard to get it open. The storm had started outside, wind whipping through the empty lot, scattering debris along the cracked pavement. As I stepped outside, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye near the tree line beyond the lot. A figure, maybe. I didn't wait to find out. I ran back to my car, heart thudding, breath coming fast and shallow. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open and starting the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway, the diner a distant blur in the rearview mirror. My hand still shook on the steering wheel, and I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But the road stayed empty as the rain began to fall harder. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those chains, those bags of bones, and the stains on the walls. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd broken into an abandoned building and found something that might have been a crime scene. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I started watching the news, looking for stories about missing people, but there wasn't anything. No reports about the diner, no investigations, like nothing had happened there at all, like it was still waiting for someone else to stop and wander inside. I've thought about going back to see if I imagined it all, but I can't. Every time I picture that freezer door swinging open, I feel the cold rush of air and hear the faint rattle of those chains. I know I wasn't supposed to find that place. And I know whoever used it might still be out there, watching for someone else to stop. Story 20. The plantation home stood at the end of a long, tree-lined road. Its white columns and wraparound porch gave it a stately, almost regal appearance. I had booked the room on a whim, looking for a quiet place to spend the weekend. The owners had restored much of the house, turning it into a charming bed and breakfast that still carried the weight of its history. The interior was elegant, filled with antique furniture and faded photographs in ornate frames. My room was on the second floor, with tall windows that let in the soft light of the afternoon. I noticed how quiet it was, even though a few other guests had checked in. The creak of the floorboards and the ticking of an old clock in the hallway were the only sounds. At dinner, the owners shared stories about the house's past. They mentioned a few local legends, but nothing too unsettling. Most of the tales were about old family feuds and the hardships of life on the plantation. No one brought up anything that hinted at the strange feeling I had when I passed the stairs to the top floor. The top floor wasn't open to guests. A velvet rope hung across the base of the staircase, and a brass sign politely requested privacy. I noticed it right away when I arrived, and even though I wasn't the type to snoop, something about it stuck in my mind. At night, I found myself listening for footsteps from above, but there was never a sound. The second night, I couldn't sleep. I decided to walk the halls for a while, hoping it would help. The house was still, the dim lights casting long shadows along the wooden floors. Without really thinking about it, I ended up standing in front of the rope at the base of the stairs. I hesitated for a few minutes before stepping over it. The staircase creaked as I climbed, but everything else was silent. When I reached the top, I found a long hallway lined with closed doors. Most of them were plain, but one door at the far end had an old iron lock. Something about it felt different, heavier, like it had a purpose beyond privacy. I stood there for a while, debating whether to try the handle. It was locked, of course, but the keyhole was large and old-fashioned. I knelt down and peered through it, expecting to see an empty room or maybe a collection of old furniture. What I saw instead made my breath catch in my throat. Inside, there was a small cot with a thin mattress. Bolted to the metal frame were 2 iron handcuffs, their chains coiled neatly on either side. The walls were bare, the floor scuffed and stained in places. There was nothing else in the room. No decorations, no personal items, just the cot and the cuffs. I pulled back quickly, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around the hallway, but there was no one else there. For a moment, I considered going back downstairs and asking the owners about it, but I knew I wouldn't get a real answer. I'd probably be told it was part of the history, or something left over from the past, nothing to worry about. I went back to my room and locked the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about that room, wondering who had stayed there and why the cuffs were there in the first place. The next morning, I considered leaving early, but curiosity kept me there. At breakfast, I asked casual questions about the top floor. The owners smiled politely and said it was just storage, nothing interesting. They mentioned that the house had once been a hospital during the war, and some of the rooms had been used for patients. But they didn't explain why a locked room would have a cot with handcuffs. Later that day, I explored the grounds. There were overgrown gardens and old sheds that hadn't been touched in years. I found a small cemetery at the back of the property, the headstones worn smooth by time. Some of the names matched the ones I had seen in the photographs inside. Others were too faded to read. That night I heard something. It was faint, like a thumping sound coming from above my room. I tried to tell myself it was the old house settling, but it kept happening, slow and steady, like footsteps pacing back and forth. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. When morning came, I was exhausted. I packed my things quickly, feeling an overwhelming need to leave. As I checked out, I asked one last question about the locked room. The owner smiled again, but this time it didn't seem as warm. She said it was better not to ask about things you didn't want to know. I drove away from the house without looking back, but even now I can still picture the view through that keyhole. The empty cot, the waiting handcuffs, and the feeling that someone at some point had been kept there against their will. And maybe, if I had stayed one more night, I would have found out why. Story 21. I took the job because I needed it, and the pay was better than anything else nearby. The prison had been shut down for nearly a decade, but the state was funding renovations to turn it into some kind of historical site. My job was basic maintenance, checking the plumbing, fixing lights, keeping the place from falling apart completely. I didn't mind the quiet most days, though the emptiness wore on me after a while. The cell blocks stretched on forever in every direction, each identical to the next. Rows of iron bars, peeling paint, and long-forgotten graffiti. Some areas were completely gutted, stripped bare for the renovations, while others were left as they had been when the last inmates left. One section, Block D, had been welded shut before I ever got there. I wasn't supposed to worry about it, according to the supervisor. He just said, "Leave it alone." For weeks I ignored Block D like I was told. The gate was sealed with thick chains and a rusted padlock. Every now and then, though, I'd get a feeling like someone was standing behind it, watching me. I always shook it off. It was an old prison. Noises carried. Shadows played tricks on you. One afternoon, the lock on the gate was gone. The chains, too. It was strange because I knew I hadn't heard anyone come in or out, but there the door stood, slightly ajar. My first thought was that some other worker had decided to clear it out early. Maybe management had changed their mind. I pushed the gate open and stepped inside. Block D was colder than the rest of the prison. I could see my breath fog the air in front of me. The light fixtures overhead buzzed faintly, but none of them worked. I used my flashlight and moved slowly down the row of cells. Most were empty, just like the rest of the place, but one cell stood out. Cell 27 was sealed shut with metal plates bolted across the bars. Heavy, thick steel covered every inch of the entrance. It looked like someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure it stayed that way, but the door had been pried open just enough to slip through. Against my better judgment, I pushed inside. The first thing I noticed was the chair. It sat in the middle of the room, directly under a bare light bulb that shouldn't have been working but glowed faintly anyway. The chair was old, wooden, with thick leather restraints on the arms and legs. The straps were stained dark brown, dried, cracked. They looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Beside the chair was a small table, and on it sat 3 old journals. The covers were worn and cracked, but they opened easily enough. I flipped through the first one, expecting old prison logs or maybe an inmate's personal notes, but it wasn't like that. The handwriting was neat, precise, and each entry was labeled as a lesson. Lesson 1 was simple. Silence. The writer described forcing someone to sit in the chair, restraining them tightly, then subjecting them to hours, maybe days of absolute silence. No light, no sound, no movement. Lesson 2 was pain. That one was harder to read. The descriptions were clinical, detached, as if the writer was documenting an experiment rather than torturing another human being. Each lesson grew more disturbing as I read on. They talked about breaking a person down, reducing them to something empty and compliant. The writer referred to their subjects only by numbers. No names, no identities, just numbers and results. The second journal was worse. It described what happened when the lessons didn't work, when someone refused to break. The methods escalated. Isolation, deprivation, mutilation. The entries became harder to follow. The handwriting grew erratic in places, almost frenzied, before returning to that same precise script, as if the writer was losing control, then forcing themselves back into calm. The third journal was almost empty. Only a few pages had been filled. One entry stood out. It was titled Lesson 10. There was no description, just one line. The final lesson is obedience. Beneath it, scrawled in thick, uneven handwriting, was a single sentence. I am still here. I backed away from the table and turned toward the door. The air in the cell felt thicker now, heavy and cold. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. The light bulb above the chair brightened for a moment before popping with a sharp crack. I stood there in the dark, trying to slow my breathing. Something moved behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps scraping against the concrete floor. I turned, shining my backup light in the direction of the sound. The chair was empty, but the restraints hung open, swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. The journals were gone from the table. I didn't wait around. I squeezed through the gap in the door and ran back down Block D. The cold followed me, a pressure at my back I couldn't explain. By the time I reached the gate, the chains and padlock were back in place, sealing the entrance like it had never been opened. My keys didn't work on the lock. It was as if I'd never been inside at all. quit the next day. I didn't tell anyone why. The supervisor didn't ask. He just nodded like he'd been expecting it. I left town after that, moved 2 states away, and tried to forget everything about that place. Sometimes I dream about cell 27. I see the chair, the journals, and the words written over and over on the walls. I am still here. When I wake up, I swear I can feel the cold, heavy air around me. And in the silence, I think I can hear those slow, scraping footsteps getting closer. Story 22. The old hospital loomed over the street, its brick facade worn but sturdy, like it had weathered every storm the past century had thrown at it. They were converting it into upscale apartments, and I was given the chance to stay overnight as part of a feature I was working on. The idea was to write a piece on the blend of history and modern living, highlighting the building's transformation. I arrived just before sunset, lugging my overnight bag up the cracked stone steps. Inside, much of the first floor had already been renovated. Gleaming tile floors replaced what was once faded linoleum, and recessed lighting brightened the wide hallways. But the upper floors remained untouched. The air felt different up there, thicker, older, like it hadn't moved in years. I was assigned one of the rooms on the 3rd floor for the night, formerly part of the patient wing. I set up my things in a space that still had its old hospital layout. The bed frame was gone, but the walls bore faint scars from where medical equipment had once hung. A single window let in what little light remained. As night fell, the silence grew heavier, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I walked the corridors after dark, flashlight in hand. Dust motes floated through the beam like tiny insects. Some doors were still closed tight, rusted shut, while others stood wide open, revealing darkened spaces that smelled faintly of antiseptic and mildew. It was easy to imagine what this place had once been: busy, noisy, filled with life, and maybe something else. I found the room around midnight. It wasn't on my map of the layout, but tucked at the end of a hallway I hadn't noticed before. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked. When I pushed it open, the hinges groaned sharply, the sound echoing down the corridor behind me. Inside, the room was bare except for the wooden floor. At first, it looked like any other room: peeling paint, broken fixtures, cracked window panes. But when I stepped inside, I noticed something carved into the wood near the center of the floor. I knelt to get a closer look. The words were fresh, the gouges in the wood clean, splinters still clinging to the edges of each letter. He's still here. The message sent a cold ripple down my back. I reached out and touched the letters, feeling the roughness where the knife or tool had dug in. It hadn't been there long, maybe hours. The dust around the letters had been disturbed, as if someone had knelt there recently, just as I was doing now. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of the silence pressing against me. It wasn't the same silence I'd felt earlier. This was thicker, heavier, like it was waiting for something. I backed out of the room slowly, shutting the door behind me without taking my eyes off it. Back in my assigned room, I locked the door and dragged one of the old cabinets in front of it. It felt foolish, but I did it anyway. My heart was still pounding, and no amount of deep breaths slowed it down. I sat on the floor with my back against the far wall, listening to the creaks and groans of the building, trying to convince myself it was all just age and wind. At some point, I dozed off, but I woke to a sound that didn't belong to the old bones of the hospital. It was soft at first, like something dragging across the floor. Then it was more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the hallway. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the door. The handle jiggled once, twice, then stopped. I thought about calling out, but my throat was too dry. I just stayed frozen in place, waiting. After what felt like an hour, the sound moved away, slow and steady down the hall. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the first gray light of morning slipped through the window. Only then did I move the cabinet away from the door and carefully open it. The hallway was empty, but there were faint scuff marks on the floor just outside, marks that hadn't been there before. I decided to leave then. I gathered my things quickly, trying not to look at the door at the end of the hall. But as I passed the stairwell, I glanced back. The door to the room with the carving was open again, wide open, though I knew I had shut it the night before. On the way out, I ran into one of the workers arriving for the day. I told him about the room, the message on the floor. He frowned and said no work had been scheduled on that floor for weeks. Then he mentioned something strange. They'd found tools missing from the supply room more than once, and sometimes the lights on the upper floors were on when no one had been working up there. I left soon after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. Even now, when I think about that place, I wonder who carved that message, or if it was a warning. Every time I do, I hear those slow footsteps in my head, pacing quietly outside a door that was never supposed to be opened. Story 23. The mining camp wasn't on any of the maps I'd brought. I found it by accident, following an old overgrown trail that cut deeper into the forest than I'd planned to go. The trees were thicker there, blocking out most of the afternoon light, and by the time I saw the cluster of cabins, the shadows had already stretched long across the ground. Everything was quiet, except for the wind pushing through the branches overhead. The cabins were gray and weathered, their roofs sagging under the weight of moss and age. Some doors hung open, others had rotted and fallen away completely. I stepped carefully, testing each board before shifting my weight, half expecting the floors to give out beneath me. The place was far from any town, and I hadn't passed another hiker all day. Most of the cabins were empty, filled only with broken furniture and old rusted tools. But one stood at the edge of the clearing, set back from the others. Its door was closed, the handle streaked with something dark. I hesitated before pushing it open, bracing myself against the frame as it creaked wide. Inside, it was cooler. Dust hung in the air, stirred up by the light that spilled through a crack in the wall. A table stood near the center, and scattered across it were journals, their leather covers cracked and brittle. I picked one up and opened it carefully, the pages stiff but still legible. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written in a hurry. The entries described life in the camp at first. Days spent working in the mines, nights drinking by the fire. But the later pages shifted, men going missing. First one, then two, then whole groups that vanished in the dark without a sound. They called it being taken, though none of them ever explained by what. I set that journal aside and picked up another. More of the same stories. Whispers heard in the woods, shapes moving between the trees. A few miners had tried leaving, but according to the pages, they never made it far. It was as if the forest itself wouldn't let them go. The last journal I read was different. The entries became frantic, sometimes just single words repeated over and over. Taken, trapped, beneath. On the final page, there was a drawing of the cabin itself, with an X marked in one corner. Underneath it, the words "they come from below" were scratched deep into the paper. I glanced toward the corner of the room where the X had been drawn. The floorboards were darker there, and as I stepped closer, I noticed the outline of a trapdoor, nearly hidden beneath years of dust and grime. I knelt down, brushing it clean with my sleeve. The edges were scarred with deep gouges, as if something with claws had raked them from the inside. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. It was cold, stiff from rust, but I managed to pull it up with a groan of old hinges. A narrow shaft dropped down into darkness, the smell of damp earth rising to meet me. Wooden rungs were hammered into the side, leading down beyond where I could see. I thought about leaving then, just walking away pretending I'd never found the journals or the trapdoor. But something about it held me there, curiosity or maybe something stronger. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it into the hole. The beam caught on dirt walls and rotting supports. There was no sound, not even the scurry of rats. I climbed down slowly, testing each rung before moving to the next. The air was heavy, pressing against my chest the deeper I went. When I finally reached the bottom, my boots sank slightly into soft earth. The tunnel stretched out ahead, just wide enough to walk through if I hunched my shoulders. The walls were covered in more scratches, some shallow, some deep enough to splinter the wood. I kept the flashlight steady, watching for any movement, but it was silent. After maybe 20 yards, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. In the center was a pile of bones, picked clean and stacked carefully. Among the bones I saw scraps of clothing, old mining helmets, and tools. But there were also more recent things. A modern flashlight, cracked and empty of batteries. A torn piece of a backpack with bright nylon straps. I stared at them, trying to understand how they had ended up here. Then I heard something behind me. A soft scraping like nails on stone. I swung the light back down the tunnel, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, closer this time. I backed away slowly, keeping the light steady. My foot brushed against something and I looked down. Another journal, its cover newer than the others. I picked it up with shaking hands and opened it. The first page had my name written across it in thick black letters. Below that, the word taken was repeated over and over, filling the rest of the page. My stomach turned cold. I dropped the journal and turned to run. The scraping became louder, faster, like something crawling quickly toward me. I sprinted down the tunnel, the light bouncing wildly off the walls. The rungs of the ladder came into view, and I scrambled up them, ignoring the pain in my hands as I pulled myself toward the surface. I slammed the trapdoor shut and shoved the nearest piece of furniture over it. The sound stopped, but I didn't wait to see if it would start again. I ran from the cabin, not stopping until I reached the tree line. Only when I was back on the old trail did I finally slow down. I didn't tell anyone about what I found in the mining camp. I'm not even sure anyone would believe me if I tried, but sometimes at night I still hear that scraping sound in my dreams, and when I wake up, I always check the floor beneath my bed. Story 24. The funeral parlor had been closed for decades. Its once white facade was weathered and streaked with grime, the windows clouded with dust. People in town whispered stories about the place, saying it was cursed, that strange things happened inside after dark. That only made me more curious. I slipped through a side door that hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of mold and old wood. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing faded wallpaper peeling away from the walls. I stepped carefully over broken floorboards as I made my way through the entry hall. The viewing rooms were down a corridor lined with tarnished sconces. Most of the rooms were empty, filled only with rows of dusty chairs and cobwebs stretched to corners. I moved from one room to the next, the silence pressing in around me. It was unsettling, but nothing I hadn't expected from a place like this. I was about to turn back when I noticed a faint scent. It wasn't mildew or rot. It was something fresher, lighter, the smell of flowers. I followed it to the last room at the end of the hall, my pulse quickening as I drew closer. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open with a hesitant hand. Inside, the room was different from the others. Clean. The air was clearer, though cold, and the dust that coated everything else seemed almost absent here. In the center of the room was an open casket, polished wood gleaming faintly under the beam of my flashlight. At its head was a tall, narrow stand holding a fresh bouquet of white lilies. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of anyone else in the building, and yet someone had placed fresh flowers here. Slowly I stepped inside, my boots muffled against the worn carpet. My breath fogged in the cold air as I approached the casket. The flowers were real. I touched one of the petals, half expecting it to crumble to dust, but it was soft and alive. Their sweet scent hung heavy around the casket, almost masking the faint odor of something old and unpleasant beneath it. I turned my attention to the open lid, bracing myself to see whatever might be lying inside. But there was no body, only an old, tarnished mirror resting flat against the satin lining. It reflected my face back at me, pale and drawn in the dim light. For a long moment I stared at my own eyes, watching my breath fog across the surface of the glass. Something about the reflection made me uneasy. I leaned in closer, trying to see if there was anything beneath the mirror. It seemed ordinary, but my gut told me something was wrong. As I stared, the reflection of my face didn't quite match my movements. When I tilted my head slightly to the right, the reflection hesitated before following. I took a step back, heart pounding now. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection was gone. The glass showed only the ceiling above and the empty room around it. Suddenly I heard a soft creak from the doorway. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but no one was there. My breathing quickened as I backed away from the casket, my skin prickling with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The door, which had been partially open, was now closed. I crossed the room quickly and tried the handle. It didn't move. I rattled it harder, but it was stuck fast, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, and then steadied again. In the brief darkness, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the room. Turning slowly, I aimed the beam back toward the casket. The bouquet was gone. In its place was a single lily lying on the closed lid, as if someone had set it there while I wasn't looking. My throat felt tight, and I could hear the faint sound of something brushing along the walls behind me. There was no way anyone should have been in there with me, but I felt it. The presence of something or someone standing just out of reach. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body stayed rooted in place. A low whisper sounded near my ear, though the words were impossible to make out. Then the door creaked again, this time slowly opening. I didn't wait. I bolted for the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the floor. I didn't stop to look behind me, didn't care what might be following. I reached the entrance and pushed through the broken door, stumbling out into the cold evening air. I didn't go back to my car right away. I stood in the middle of the cracked pavement, shaking, trying to catch my breath. The funeral parlor loomed behind me, quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. But I could still smell the faint scent of lilies clinging to my clothes. That night, I dreamed of the mirror, of my reflection staring back at me, smiling when I wasn't. In the dream, something climbed out of the casket and stood where I had been standing. and when I woke up, the faint scent of flowers lingered in my room, though there were none there. Story 25. The old prison had been closed for nearly 40 years. When they announced tours would be open for a limited time, I couldn't resist the opportunity to see inside. There was something about the place that fascinated me. The history, the stories, the rumors of what went on behind its walls. I signed up for a weekday tour, thinking it would be less crowded. The building loomed over the empty parking lot as I arrived, its stone walls stained dark with time and weather. Rusted bars lined the narrow windows, and the watchtowers were empty silhouettes against a gray sky. A group of about 10 people stood near the entrance, waiting for the guide to begin. I joined them quietly, my eyes drifting over the place as if it might reveal some of its secrets just by looking at it. The guide was a middle-aged man with a serious expression, his voice even as he led us inside. He spoke of overcrowding, of riots, of inmates who never left. The halls echoed with our footsteps as we walked through, the cold seeping into my skin, despite my jacket. Every door was heavy and iron, every corridor dim and claustrophobic. We visited the mess hall first, then the cell blocks. Most of the cells were empty, but some still held rusted bed frames and broken sinks. There were carvings in the walls, names, dates, angry words scratched deep into the stone. The guide explained that solitary confinement was at the far end of the prison, isolated from everything else. He said we would be going there last. As we moved toward that wing, the rest of the group grew quieter. The air felt heavier the deeper we went, and the smell of damp stone and old rust filled my nose. The hallway to solitary was narrower than the others. The guide opened the first few cells and let us look inside. Small, bare rooms with nothing but darkness and silence. I lingered near the back as we walked. Something about the place made my skin crawl, like I was being watched. The group stopped in front of one particular cell. The guide said this one had held some of the most violent inmates, men who had lost their minds in the darkness. He unlocked the heavy door and pushed it open. The others walked past it, looking inside and moving on. I stood there a moment longer, staring into the dim room. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I saw something that made me step forward. The walls inside were covered in paper. Dozens, maybe hundreds of photographs taped up and overlapping like wallpaper made of faces. I stepped inside without thinking, drawn by morbid curiosity. The photos were all black and white, grainy and old. Each one showed a person staring directly at the camera. Men, women, children, none of them smiling. And every single one had their eyes scratched out, gouged deep into the paper until there was nothing left but empty holes. I moved along the wall, shining my flashlight on the faces. The scratching was violent, deep grooves that had torn through the images. Some were old, yellowed at the edges. Others looked newer, the paper still crisp. As I reached the far wall, my stomach twisted sharply. There was a photo taped to the door on the inside. It was color, not black and white. It was me, standing in my backyard. The photo was recent. I recognized the shirt I'd worn just last week. My eyes had been scratched out in the same brutal way as the others. Underneath the photo was a date written in thick black marker. Today's date. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam jerking wildly over the room. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stared at that picture, cold spreading through my chest. There was no way it should be here. No one should have had a picture like that. The sound of the guide calling for the group snapped me out of it. I turned and left the cell, my heart pounding. The others were already heading back down the hall, their footsteps distant. I hurried to catch up, glancing back at the cell one last time. The door was swinging slightly, creaking in the silence. But I didn't say anything as we finished the tour. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. By the time we reached the entrance, my hands were clammy and my throat was dry. I walked straight to my car without looking back, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise in the house made me jump. I kept thinking about that photo, about how close it must have been taken. Someone had to have been watching me, and they had been close enough to take that picture without me ever knowing. The next day, I checked every window and door. I scanned the yard, looking for any sign of someone having been there. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That I found a picture of myself in an old prison. It sounded insane. For the next few days, I stayed alert. I avoided going out at night, kept my curtains closed. But then the phone calls started. Silent at first, then breathing, slow, steady breathing that sent a cold spike through me each time I answered. I stopped picking up after the third one. A week later, I found another picture taped to my front door. It was me again, sitting in my living room, watching TV. My eyes had been scratched out just like before. There was a date on this one too. Tomorrow. Story 26. The trail I was following had all but disappeared beneath the undergrowth, but I kept pushing forward. I hadn't seen another hiker for miles, and the forest around me was thick and quiet, heavy with the scent of damp pine. The map I brought along didn't show any cabins out here, but I stumbled onto one just as I was thinking about turning back. It was small and crooked, tucked between two tall pines, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The door hung slightly open, creaking softly as the breeze moved through it. At first I hesitated in there with one foot on the threshold, listening for any sign that someone was inside. There was nothing, only the wind whispering through the trees and the faint buzz of insects. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, carrying a sharp undertone that I couldn't immediately place. Dust hung in the air, catching the weak sunlight streaming through the dirty windows. There wasn't much inside. An old cot sat in one corner, and a broken table with rusted tools scattered across it rested nearby. The place looked abandoned, the kind of place no one had visited for years. But then I noticed the wall on the far side of the room. It was covered in Polaroids, lined up in rows from the ceiling down to the floor. My boots crunched over broken glass as I approached, every step feeling heavier than the last. The photos showed people sitting in chairs, their arms tied to the rests and their heads slumped forward. Each one of them wore a blindfold, strips of cloth wound tightly over their eyes. I stood there staring, my throat dry and tight. Some of the photos were old, their colors faded to a sickly yellow. Others looked fresh, the whites still crisp and bright. I leaned in closer, noticing dates scrawled along the bottom edges in black marker. Some went back years, but a few had dates from just weeks ago. I took a step back, heart pounding, as it sank in that someone had been here recently. Whoever had taken these pictures wasn't some long-forgotten figure in the past. They might still be close. The thought made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I forced myself to keep looking, trying to understand what I was seeing. In some of the pictures, the people looked terrified, their mouths open as if they were screaming. Others seemed unconscious, their heads lolling to one side. There were no identifying features I could make out, no names written anywhere. Just faces I would never forget and dates that told me this wasn't over. I glanced around the cabin again, more cautious now. The place seemed still, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My fingers itched to pull out my phone and call for help, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. I told myself I needed to leave, but my legs wouldn't move at first. On the floor beneath a wall of photos, there was an old wooden box. Its lid was half open, and curiosity pulled me toward it, despite the dread settling heavy in my chest. Inside there were more Polaroids, a pile of them that hadn't yet been pinned to the wall. I picked one up carefully. It showed a man with dark hair tied to a chair, the same blindfold over his face. The date on this one was tomorrow. I dropped it back into the box and stumbled away. My pulse hammered in my ears as I turned toward the door. As I moved, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A camera on a tripod stood near one of the windows. It was pointed at the center of the room where a chair had been set up. Rope was coiled neatly on the floor beside it. The setup was waiting for someone. I hurried outside, not bothering to be quiet anymore. The trees felt closer now, the shadows darker, like the forest had closed in while I was inside. I walked fast at first, then ran, following the faint trail I had left behind when I first found the cabin. My thoughts raced as quickly as my feet. Who were those people in the pictures? And who was the one taking them? After what felt like hours, I finally reached a ridge where my phone buzzed back to life. I stopped only long enough to call for help, giving them my rough location and everything I could describe about the cabin. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could hear her typing rapidly as I spoke. She told me to stay on the line as I made my way back to the nearest trailhead. By the time I saw my car again, the sun was slipping behind the trees. I locked myself inside, hands shaking as I waited for law enforcement to arrive. They showed up an hour later, and I led them back as far as I could. But when we reached the clearing where the cabin had been, it was gone. The ground where it stood was churned up, as if something heavy had been dragged away. The trees around the clearing were marked with deep cuts, like claw marks or maybe something from machinery. The photos, the camera, the box, everything had vanished without a trace. They told me I must have been mistaken, that maybe I got turned around. But I know what I saw. I can still see the faces of those people in my mind every time I close my eyes. And I wonder if whoever took those photos is out there right now, setting up their camera again, waiting for someone else to wander too far off the trail. Story 27. I worked for a company that cleaned out foreclosed homes. Most of the time it was pretty standard. Junk left behind, old furniture, the occasional rotten food in the fridge. Sometimes it was sad, seeing lives abandoned in cardboard boxes and scattered clothes. But this one house was different from the start. It was on the outskirts of town, isolated and half hidden by overgrown trees. The windows were boarded up, and the grass was waist high. The house had been empty for a while, longer than most we got called to clean. When I pulled up in my truck, I noticed right away how quiet it was out there. Too quiet, even for the countryside. The front door stuck at first, but I managed to push it open. Inside, the house smelled stale, like mold and old wood. The living room was bare except for a broken couch and a toppled lamp. Dust hung in the air like smoke. I moved through the rooms quickly, wanting to get it over with. The upstairs was just as empty. Peeling wallpaper, cracked tiles in the bathroom, and an old mattress in one of the bedrooms. It was when I got to the basement door that I noticed something strange. The door was reinforced with a heavy lock. That wasn't normal. Foreclosed homes didn't usually have locked interior doors, especially not leading to the basement. At first, I figured it was just an old security measure. Maybe the last owner stored valuables down there. But curiosity got the better of me. I called my boss to let him know, and he told me to break the lock if I had to. We were supposed to clear out the entire house after all. So I grabbed my crowbar and worked at it until the latch snapped open. The basement stairs creaked under my boots as I descended. It was darker down there, colder too. I had my flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the gloom. The basement was unfinished, bare concrete walls, exposed pipes overhead. But then I saw the door. Another one. Smaller. It was metal, bolted to the frame like someone had gone out of their way to keep it sealed tight. The key was already in the lock. I hesitated, feeling my pulse in my throat, but I turned it anyway. The door swung open with a long, low groan. Inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Sharp, metallic, and sour. Like old blood. My flashlight shook a little as I raised it. In the center of the room was a dentist's chair. Its white surface was streaked with dark stains, some fresh enough to still be sticky. Straps hung from the armrests and footrest, cracked and stained. There was a tray next to it, filled with tools. Not the kind you see in a dentist's office, though. These were older, heavier, some of them rusted. Forceps, scalpels, pliers. Things I didn't want to think about. A camera sat on a tripod facing the chair. Its lens was cracked, but the red light on the back blinked faintly, as if it was still on. A cable ran from it to a battered laptop sitting on a metal table nearby. The screen was dark, but when I nudged the mouse, it flickered to life. Folders filled the desktop, each labeled with dates that stretched back years. I didn't open any of them. I didn't need to. I could imagine too easily what was in there. My hands started shaking as I stepped back from the chair. That was when I saw the stains on the floor. Drag marks in the dust and old, dried blood leading from the door to the chair. Whoever had been here last didn't leave on their own. The walls were covered in scratch marks, long gouges carved deep into the concrete, like someone had clawed at them, trying to get out. Some of the scratches had blood in them. Smears of it dark brown now, but unmistakable. I backed out of the room slowly, trying not to make a sound. I made it to the stairs before I heard something above me. A thump. Then the sound of footsteps moving across the floor upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. I was sure I had locked the front door behind me. I knew I had. But someone was up there now, walking slowly toward the basement door. I killed my flashlight and stood in the dark, pressing myself against the cold concrete wall. The basement door creaked open. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, like whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. A faint beam of light swept across the stairs as they began to descend. I didn't wait. I bolted for the other side of the basement, looking for another way out. There was a window, small and filthy, near the ceiling. I scrambled up the wall, pushing away old boxes and trash to reach it. My fingers slipped on the latch, but I managed to force it open and squeeze through, scraping my back on the jagged frame. I hit the ground outside hard but didn't stop. I ran through the tall grass, not looking back until I reached my truck. I jumped in and locked the doors, starting the engine with shaking hands. I drove away fast, tires spinning in the dirt, not slowing down until I was miles away. Later I told my boss I quit. I didn't tell him why. I didn't tell anyone. But sometimes at night, I think about the camera's blinking red light and the folders on that laptop. And I wonder who was watching from the top of the stairs, waiting for me to sit in that chair. Story 28. The old train depot had been sitting on the edge of town for as long as I could remember. It was the kind of place people talked about but never really visited. I'd driven past it dozens of times on my way to work, always meaning to check it out but never making the effort. One overcast afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of me, and I decided to see what was inside. The place was mostly surrounded by chain link fencing, but there were enough gaps to squeeze through if you tried. The depot itself was quiet, almost too quiet, and it smelled like rust and damp wood. Most of the buildings had collapsed roofs, but the old train cars sat on the tracks like they were waiting for passengers that would never come. I climbed up into one of the cars, careful not to step on anything that might give way under my weight. The first few cars were empty except for rotting seats and broken windows. There were old advertisements still clinging to the walls in places, faded and yellowed by time. I thought about turning back, but something kept me moving forward. When I reached the third car, the door was wedged halfway open, like someone had forced it. Inside, the air was heavier, carrying a sour, metallic smell that made my stomach turn. It was darker in there, and I had to use the flashlight on my phone just to see more than a few feet ahead. The seats had all been ripped out, leaving the floor wide open. That's when I saw the bed sitting at the far end of the car. It wasn't a regular bed. It looked like something you'd see in a hospital, with metal rails on the sides and thick leather restraints attached at the corners. The mattress was stained and dirty, and there were marks in the metal where the paint had worn away, as if something or someone had struggled there. I stood frozen for a few seconds, listening to the silence press in on me. Next to the bed was a small closet built into the side of the car. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see fabric inside. I walked over slowly, feeling the floor creak under my boots. When I opened the door the rest of the way, I found rows of children's clothes hanging neatly on rusted hangers. There were dresses, shirts, pants, and even tiny shoes placed carefully on the floor below. Each piece of clothing had a name written inside, either on the tag or with black marker on the fabric itself. Some of the names were familiar in a way I couldn't explain. I ran my hand over one of the dresses and felt something sharp poke my finger. Pulling it back, I saw there was a pin stuck through the collar with a small piece of paper attached. The paper had a date scrawled on it in the same handwriting as the names. I stepped back, feeling my chest tighten. There were dozens of outfits in that closet, maybe more, and each one was labeled. Some looked new, as if they'd never been worn, while others were old and threadbare. A few still had stains I didn't want to think about. I looked around the car again and noticed more details I hadn't seen before. Scratches in the walls near the bed. A camera mounted in the corner, its lens cracked but still pointed toward the bed. An old metal toolbox sat on the floor nearby, and when I opened it, I found rows of surgical tools, each one stained with something dark and flaking. The air felt colder then, though I was sweating. I backed out of the closet and started moving toward the door. Before I reached it, something clattered behind me. I turned fast, shining my light toward the sound, but nothing was there. My heartbeat was pounding in my ears, and I could feel my legs starting to shake. I didn't run, but I moved as fast as I could without falling through the rotting floor. Once I was back outside, I sucked in deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I thought about calling someone, but I wasn't sure who. The police? Would they even believe me? I walked back through the depot as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. When I reached the fence, I didn't bother finding the gap. I climbed over it, scraping my palms raw, and stumbled back to my car. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, and I didn't stop shaking until I was halfway home. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clothes and the names written inside them. I thought about those dates pinned to the collars and what they might mean. Were they birth dates? Disappearances? Something worse? The next day, I searched news archives online. It took a while, but I found a few of the names listed in missing children reports from years back. Some had vanished decades ago, others more recently. None of them had ever been found. I called the police and told them everything. They took me seriously after they saw the photos I'd taken with my phone. The place was sealed off not long after, and I heard there was an investigation, but no one ever told me what they found or if anyone was arrested. I drive a different way to work now, avoiding the road that passes the old depot. Sometimes I wonder how many more places like that exist, hidden in plain sight, and how many people know about them but choose to stay silent. Story 29. The theme park had been shut down for over a decade. Its rusting gates stood half open, creaking when the wind pushed through. Most people in town avoided the place, but curiosity got the better of me. On a cloudy afternoon, I climbed over the fence, my boots crunching on the cracked pavement as I made my way inside. Rides sat frozen in time, their colors faded and peeling. The Ferris wheel loomed like a giant skeleton against the gray sky. Game booths were gutted, their stuffed animals long since rotted away or stolen. I wandered aimlessly at first, taking pictures and kicking through the debris. It wasn't until I found a narrow path between two roller coasters that I noticed the old maintenance sheds. There were 3 of them, squat metal buildings with broken windows. The doors hung crooked on their hinges, and vines had crawled up their sides. I walked toward the one in the middle, feeling a prickle of unease as I got closer. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and something sour that made me cover my nose. Broken tools littered the floor, and shelves sagged under the weight of old equipment. At first, it looked like any other forgotten storage space. Then I noticed the cages. They were stacked 2, sometimes 3 high along the back wall. Heavy-duty metal with thick bars and reinforced locks. Some were large enough to hold a person, others much smaller, but all of them were empty now. The floors of several cages were stained dark, and deep scratch marks scarred the insides. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I took a step closer, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. The locks were rusted but still secured, as if they'd been shut tight and never reopened. One of the cages had a frayed rope tied to its bars, like something had once been fastened to it. On the wall opposite the cages was a massive bulletin board. It was covered edge to edge with missing person posters, dozens of them. Some were faded and curling at the edges, others looked newer, their colors still bright. Names and faces stared out at me, each one with a desperate plea beneath it. They were from different towns, some close, others hours away. A few of the posters were handwritten, with phone numbers and personal notes scrawled in the margins. There were children, teenagers, and adults. One page in the center stood out, because the photo on it was the same as one I'd seen on a telephone pole near my house just a week ago. I stepped back, my chest tight, and almost tripped over a pile of old blankets on the floor. They smelled awful, mold and something worse clinging to them. Beneath the blankets, I saw an empty food tray and a broken water bottle. My mouth went dry as I realized these cages had been used recently. A faint noise made me freeze. It was a metallic click, soft but close. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my ears. The door I'd pushed open was now swinging shut. It didn't slam, just eased closed until it clicked into place. I rushed to it, grabbing the handle and yanking hard. It didn't budge. The lock had been repaired from the outside. Panic surged as I shook the door, kicking at it until my foot ached. The shed was suddenly too quiet, like the world outside had been cut off completely. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. I forced myself to calm down and look for another way out. There was a small window high on the wall, but it was covered with wire mesh that wouldn't pull free. The other two sheds might have been connected, but there were no doors leading between them. I was trapped. As I moved back toward the cages, I noticed something carved into the wood just above the bulletin board. It was shallow but deliberate. "They watch from below," it said. I didn't know what it meant, but it made my skin crawl. The air grew colder the longer I stayed inside. Time seemed to stretch out, each minute dragging. Then I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel. They stopped just on the other side of the door. I pressed my ear to the metal, holding my breath. For a moment there was nothing. Then a soft scratching sound, like something dragging across the surface. I backed away quickly, heart racing. The scratching stopped, but I could sense someone or something still standing there. A shadow moved past the broken window, blocking out the weak light for an instant. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. I grabbed a rusted wrench from a nearby shelf and held it tight, even though it felt useless. More time passed, or maybe not much at all, I couldn't tell anymore. Eventually the footsteps moved away, but I didn't feel any relief. I stayed crouched by the cages, wrench in hand, waiting for something else to happen. Hours must have gone by before the door finally creaked open again. It moved slowly, as if inviting me to step out. I didn't trust it. I waited another long stretch of time before I finally worked up the courage to move. Outside, the light was dim, like dusk had fallen. The gravel was disturbed, marked by footprints that circled the shed over and over again. I ran without thinking, cutting through the overgrown pathways back toward the entrance. The rides loomed on either side of me, casting strange shadows as the last light faded. When I reached the fence, I scrambled over it, tearing my hands on the rusted wire. I didn't stop running until I reached the road where my car was parked. I locked the doors and sped away without looking back. Even now, I can't stop thinking about the cages, the posters, and the message carved into the wall. I don't know who or what was watching me that day, but I know I was never supposed to leave that shed. Story 30. The old military hospital had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. Its concrete walls were stained with water damage, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. I had heard stories about it being haunted, but I wasn't there for ghosts. I was there because I wanted to see what was left behind in a place that once held life and death in its hands. I walked through the entrance, stepping carefully over fallen beams and shattered glass. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Each of my footsteps echoed down the long, empty hallways. There were rusted gurneys, broken wheelchairs, and papers scattered across the floor, as if everyone had left in a hurry. The deeper I went, the colder it felt, even though it was a warm day outside. I passed rooms with old beds, most of them stripped bare, though a few still had stained mattresses. I shined my flashlight along the walls, catching glimpses of faded posters and handwritten notes left behind. A sense of unease settled in my stomach, but I pushed on. Eventually, I reached a wing marked surgery. The letters were barely visible beneath layers of grime. I stepped through the doorway and immediately noticed something strange. In the thick blanket of dust on the floor, there were fresh footprints. They led straight down the hall, their pattern deliberate, as if someone had walked through just moments before. I followed the prints carefully, my heartbeat thudding louder with every step. They stopped at the door to one of the operating rooms. The door was half open, swaying gently on its hinges as though someone had just passed through. I took a breath and nudged it open farther, peering inside. The room was dim, my flashlight's beam catching on metal surgical tools scattered across a tray. In the center of the room stood an old surgical bed, its leather straps frayed but intact. The footprints ended right beside it, on the left side where a doctor might have stood. The sheets on the bed were stained, and they looked like they had been disturbed recently. Then I heard it. A faint voice, tinny and mechanical, playing from a speaker somewhere in the room. I turned my head, trying to locate it. The words repeated over and over, steady and chilling. "Don't scream, they'll hear you." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but the message was anything but. I moved toward the sound, shining my light around the room. There was a small speaker mounted in the corner near the ceiling, its red light blinking as the recording looped. I stood there, listening to it repeat, feeling the weight of the words settle over me. I didn't know who they were, but I didn't want to find out. Suddenly, I heard a faint scrape behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. Nothing. The room was empty except for the bed and the tools. I stepped backward, not taking my eyes off the shadows in the corner. The recording kept playing, the same phrase over and over. I moved toward the door, ready to leave, when I noticed something else. There were new footprints beside the first set. They weren't there before. They were heavier, deeper, like someone larger had been standing there moments ago. My skin crawled as I realized they were facing me. I forced myself to step into the hallway, keeping my light focused ahead. The recording was still faintly audible, growing softer as I moved away from the room. My breath came fast, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The hallway seemed darker now, the light from my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. I walked quickly, then broke into a jog. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. I told myself it was my imagination, that there was no one else there. But I didn't believe it. The air felt too heavy, too still, and the silence after the recording stopped felt worse than the sound itself. When I finally reached the entrance again, I almost ran straight through without stopping. But something made me look back. Down the hallway, past the debris and the broken lights, I saw a shape. Tall, unmoving, standing just at the edge of the darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it watching me. I stumbled outside, my legs shaky beneath me. The sunlight hurt my eyes after being inside for so long. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car, parked a half-mile down the overgrown road. I slammed the door shut and locked it, even though I was alone. Or at least I hoped I was. As I drove away, I couldn't get the sound of that voice out of my head. "Don't scream, they'll hear you." I kept replaying it over and over, wondering who had set it up and why. I wondered how fresh those footprints had really been, and who they belonged to. I haven't told many people about what I saw in that hospital. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, but I still dream about it sometimes. In the dreams, I'm back in that surgical room, standing beside the bed, listening to that voice whispering the same warning. And sometimes in those dreams, I'm not alone.